It's 900 hours Central Africa time here on the Newsroom, Jumbo Africa. I'm Elvis Presley.
A very good morning to you, Kendall Mahamati.
Now, we will be with you until 12 o'clock today. The focus is still on Zimbabwe because it's still a boiling point there, Kendall. Now, the SABC has reliably learned that Zimbabwe is likely to have a transitional government following the army takeover there yesterday.
Very interesting. We have been staying as close to it as we can and bringing it to you as we get it. But we want to find out from you, what do you think led to President Robert Mugabe's downfall?
That's the question we want to pose to you. We'd like to find out on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom as well as on the Facebook page. Let's take a look at what you are telling. Lawrence Khapara says, grace. Graciously grace.
Ramaseka says, apart from his dictatorship, Robert Mugabe fought for Africans. He tried to shape Zimbabwe and he became arrogant. And the people from Zimbabwe suffered a great deal and ended up fleeing the country. Now, the dictator, he was not captured like Zuma.
So says Ramaseka. You can keep them coming. We'll read them as we continue. But we're also We're also looking at South Africa, who is facing a major problem with copper theft. Now, the scourge is escalating and has a negative ripple effect in almost all walks of life. 5 billion rand a year. That is what it cost our economy.
Yeah, that's a lot of money considering the economic times and the straits that we find ourselves in. And we want to find out from you, should cable theft be declared an economic crime? Should it be made more serious than just petty theft?
Well, right now we have 237 votes in and 8% are suggesting no, that it shouldn't be declared an economic crime because it will have an impact on you who does the crime, because you'll pay.
You reckon they're watching?
They're watching. 92% are saying yes, it should be declared an economic crime.
Let's see what's being said on social media. We've got one from Mahafa Noel here who says cable theft should be declared. It's a serious crime and it affects the economy of the country negatively. So yes, Mahafa agrees it should be declared an economic crime.
Oliver Tambo says all crimes are economic crimes because it impacts on all of us.
Matolengwa 1 also calling himself Oliver Tambo.
Well,
we've got a sporting question as well, don't we, Elvis?
That's
a lot has happened since we left the studio yesterday.
We were sitting with bated breath and waiting for this announcement, and we were all disappointed, Kendall. Well, wow. Some of us.
Some of us were disappointed. And are you one of those that were disappointed that South Africa did not get the hosting rights for the 2023 Rugby World Cup? Tell us, what's being said?
Well, let's take a look at what you're telling us. Dr. Moses Villani says, nope, I am happy. After all, the rugby is for a few who can afford premium packages.
That is so true. If you cannot afford a premium package, you cannot watch rugby in South Africa. Well said, well put.
That's on DSTV, right?
Exactamundo. Sisongo Mlamna says, no, I'm not disappointed. I'd be disappointed if it was athletics because we lead thanks to Lubuyo Manyonga and Caster Semenya as well as Wade van Niekerk, and all the others are coming after them as well, of course.
Well, there you have it. Keep them coming. We'll read them as we continue. But right now, it's time to get down to business and take a look at your news headlines. Zimbabwe is likely to have a transitional government following yesterday's army takeover. The National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union has condemned the transporting of corpses using an open trailer in Johannesburg yesterday. And a legal battle is looming between lawyers representing Madiba's former wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and executors of the late President Nelson Mandela's will. Now, those are all your headlines, but before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening on the sports front.
Elvis, quite a lot. Thanks very much. Yes, this is one of the big stories of the day after yesterday. And you know what? We'll be trying to keep abreast of what people have to say.
You know, there's a lot of questions around this because, I mean, we were the front runners. We've even said that we were the favorites to win this particular bid.
And the very first time that the World Council goes against the unanimous recommendation.
Yes.
Very interesting that. Good morning to you. This is what we've got for you in the sports today. SARA President Mark Alexander calls the World Rugby Council voting process totally flawed after the vote result pulls the carpet out from under South Africa's feet, with a vote going to France for the hosting rights for Rugby World Cup 2023.
The process was totally flawed. Our process became totally flawed. It was totally robust and vigorous for 14 months. in the last 2 weeks to go away. It's unbelievable.
Over cover he goes. That is beautiful. It's gone all the way.
The Titans get off to a great start in this year's Ramslam T20 with Henry Davids and Aiden Makram setting up a 38-run victory over the Knights as Dale Steyn gets a wicket on his long-awaited return to competitive cricket.
This will be out. It's taken. Dale Steyn gets his first wicket back in over a year.
You can imagine had it gone there, played and had an unfortunate incident, we would be crying foul that, but wait a minute, we all knew that he was on a sensitive period.
Kaizer Chiefs coach Steve Kompela, who's in his third season at Chiefs, is under pressure to win his first trophy for the club. He's happy that his keeper Itumeleng Kure made it back from international duty fit and ready to play. We'll have this in more detail at 10:40. Do stick around. Elvis has got the news.
Thank you, Kendall. Top story this morning. The SADC ministerial troika meeting is expected to resume in the capital city of Botswana in Gaborone this morning, or this afternoon rather. The meeting coincides with President Jacob Zuma's long-planned bi-national commission in Botswana. The current political crisis in Zimbabwe will be high on the agenda. The SABC has meanwhile reliably learned that Zimbabwe is likely to have a transitional government following yesterday's army takeover. Dismissed former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa is expected to lead the transitional government along with stakeholders from other political parties. Last night, the South African delegation attended meetings with different parties to get first-hand information on what is to be done to return Zimbabwe to normalcy. President Jacob Zuma's Defense and Military Veterans Minister, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, and the Minister of State Security, Bongani Bongo, as the envoys to chart the way forward for Zimbabwe. Now, in the proposed deal, President Robert Mugabe has been given an opportunity to negotiate an exit that includes state protection for him and his family. The president remained confined to his home. Now, for the latest update from Harare, we now speak to our correspondent, Effort Musukiwa. Very good morning to you, Effort, and welcome. Effort, are you there? Effort, can you hear me? Well, it seems like we've lost Effort there. We're going to try and get him back on the line as soon as possible to give us an update as to what is happening there. Meanwhile, the AU Commission chairperson, Musa Faki Mahamat, says that the developments in Zimbabwe are being closely monitored. He has urged all parties involved to act in accordance with the nation's constitution. Speaking through an interpreter, Faki Mahamat stressed the military's move to seize power from Mugabe was not a coup.
Addressing an audience in the US Capitol ahead of his planned talks with the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson later this week, the AU Commission chair, via a translator, said the developments in Zimbabwe were being closely monitored and urged all parties involved to act in accordance with the nation's constitution, but stressed the military's move to seize power from President Mugabe was not a coup.
The military have reassured us that this is not a coup d'etat. And as you know, the African Union is against any unconstitutional change of government. But any body coming to power by force is, of course, condemned by the African Union. This is a very fundamental principle of the African Union.
He went on to say it was crucial that the crisis is resolved in a manner that promotes democracy and human rights, as well as the socio-economic development of Zimbabwe, while also confirming that President Jacob Zuma had sent a delegation to Harare. The US government has reacted by calling on all Zimbabwean leaders to exercise restraint, respect the rule of law, and to quickly resolve differences to allow for a rapid return to normalcy. The US Embassy in Zimbabwe's capital is advising employees to stay home, issuing an advisory warning to American citizens in the country to shelter in place as a result of this ongoing political uncertainty.
Well, for the latest news from Harare, let's now speak to our correspondent, Effort Musukiwa. Effort, a very good morning. Can you tell us what happened overnight in Harare?
Good morning, Elvis. I can indeed confirm that President Zuma's envoy arrived early last night around 7 p.m. And they went straight into closed-door meetings with relevant stakeholders. The meetings went on pretty much most of the night. I last spoke to the South African ambassador to Zimbabwe, Takamande, at around 1 a.m. this morning, and he told me they were still, and once they had concluded, they will be getting an official statement or an official update as to what has transpired and what agreements have been reached. Elvis?
Can you expand on these relevant stakeholders that the envoys were talking to? Who were they?
We do understand that they were talking to the military officials. They were talking. They had also planned to meet with President Robert and also some civic society groups. So we are still waiting to get confirmation who they actually managed to speak to. No official communication has been given as of yet. No information is available. We also try to get to grips and to get to an understanding as to what has happened.
Now, the SABC has meanwhile reliably learned that Zimbabwe is likely to have a transitional government. Can you tell us about this possibility?
The same statements were echoed by the Zimbabwe Liberation War Veterans Association. They held a press conference yesterday afternoon. These are a group of war veterans that have been aligned to the fired former Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa. They have made public calls to Emerson Mnangagwa to succeed President Robert Mugabe. And yesterday, during the press conference, they said that the situation in Zimbabwe was not going to take one political party to resolve. It was going to take the collective action of all political parties, all civil society, and all Zimbabweans. And they called on the Zimbabweans to embrace this move that the military has done. So it was like an indirect indication to say that they are actually proposing a government of national unity or a transitional government that takes over from the current setting that we have at the present moment. So those reports might actually have a base in that even the ones that wanted Emerson Mnangagwa to take over from ZANU-PF are actually now calling for a unity government rather than an Emerson Mnangagwa takeover alone.
The Youth League also had to apologize live on television to the military for the takeover. What do you know of that? And some people asking the question whether or not he was pushed or pressured.
Yes, it is true that Secretary for Youth Affairs, Kuzana Chipanga, made a public apology. It was directed to the Zimbabwe Defense Forces Commander, General Chiwenga. But in that statement as well, he actually said he had not been coerced, but he had realized that he had made a mistake. He had realized that he was unduly influenced and he was ill-advised when he made the statement. So really, that he was forced to say it, or it is true that he just said he has come to terms. But he did make a public apology, and he has actually called or asked there's a personal one-on-one meeting with the general to try and explain himself and try and apologize to him directly.
In general, how is ordinary Zimbabweans reacting to the takeover by the military, and what's the situation on the ground like?
Well, the situation on the ground right now is that we've been around parts of the CBD. People are going on about their business. People are actually trooping to town. I think the traffic flow today is a bit higher than what it was yesterday. So we expect some kind of normalcy, but you have the military, the army still on the streets. They are still manning the same positions they were manning yesterday, but they've opened the roads so it's accessible. You can drive past, you can actually go past the parliament building, you can actually go past the presidential office in town. But Zimbabweans are a bit, the election is varied. You have some that are actually celebrating what the military has done, but you also have another group of people that are not so sure what the next move is. When we spoke to some, saying We don't know the intentions of the military after this. We don't know if the military is willing and are prepared to hand over power once whatever they want to resolve is resolved. So people are still very anxious. People are still very skeptical. Some are unsure as to what really is going to happen after this. The direction is very diverse.
Effort, I thank you so much for that update. That was our correspondent in Harare, Effort Musikiwa, giving us the latest there. Now, we spoke about the Youth League wing. The head of the Youth League wing of Zimbabwe's ruling party has meanwhile publicly apologized on state television to the military. Kudzai Chipanga, whose powerful ZANU-PF youth wing has been a strong supporter of Mugabe and his wife Grace, said that he had voluntarily given his statement apologizing for criticizing the Defense Force chief, General Constantino Chiwenga. It was an abrupt turn for Chipanga, who on Tuesday accused the army chief of subverting the constitution.
I kindly request General Chiwenga to please say, accept my apologies on behalf of the Youth League and myself. We are still young people, we are still growing up, we learn from our mistakes, and from this big mistake, we have learned a lot. I also like to emphasize that this statement which I have given, I have not been persuaded, neither coerced or forced to do as such. I'm emphasizing that I have reflected on my own as a young person, as a leader of the Youth League. Hence, I have come to this juncture of offering myself to the state media to give this public apology. We shall also make frantic efforts to approach the commanders of our defense forces in person so that we convey this apology. I thank you.
Now, for the latest on the situation in Zimbabwe, we have the head of governance and foreign policy program at South African Institute International Affairs, Mr. Stephen Grits, in studio. A very good morning to you, sir, and welcome.
Morning, Elvis.
First and foremostly, the situation in Zimbabwe. What do you make of it as it stands?
So, this is an interesting week, and they say a week is a long time in politics. I think this was all triggered a week ago with President Mugabe's firing of Emerson Mnangagwa as his vice president. And then we had the military making warnings, arrests, and then, it seems like people are calling it a soft coup. Nobody has really wanted to use the word coup because that goes against the principles of SADC, the principles of the African Union, which are both very against what are called unconstitutional changes of government. So we're in a funny interim period because President Mugabe is still the head of state as it stands, but his movement is restricted. He's apparently under house arrest. And we've got an interesting development now that you're reporting on, that a possible transitional government might be installed. Whereas for me yesterday, this really looked like an internal battle within ZANU-PF, that the faction that was supporting Mnangagwa and the military, the police and so on, had moved against the other faction which was supporting Grace Mugabe.
How did Robert Mugabe, or perhaps Grace Mugabe, read this so wrong? Because when Mnangagwa went, we knew there was going to be problems.
I think he overplayed his hand. Mugabe's been a master strategist for many, many years. But I think really firing Mnangagwa has created this situation. And I think it's not unconnected to his wife's political ambitions. She was apparently, she was booed at a rally by his supporters. And then, may have asked or requested or demanded that the VP be fired. And it has led to this chain of events that has really may well spell the beginning of the end for President Mugabe.
Now, we're asking our question this morning to our viewers, and I would like to pose it to you as well. What do you think led eventually to the downfall of Robert Mugabe, his fall from grace?
So in all of these historical occurrences, you will have long-term causes and you'll have the trigger. The trigger, I think, was, as I've already said, the firing of the vice president. But, the economy has been suffering for 17 years. For the last, we saw the hyperinflation 10 years ago. There's no cash in the economy. Civil servants are not being paid. The army has been, they've been struggling to pay the army for a while. So the economy has deteriorated, the politics has deteriorated. There was a refusal really to name a successor. President Mugabe has not facilitated that process. So I think there's been frustration within the party, And this faction fight has really been going on for a long time. I think it was quite acute from 2014 when Joyce Mujuru was fired as a vice president and eventually kicked out of the party. So I think that people have been talking about a breaking point in Zimbabwe for a long time. I was there in June last year in Harare. I spoke to maybe 15 people, and everybody said we're hitting the breaking point. And I think so the long-term causes have coalesced over a trigger, and the trigger was the firing of Mnangagwa.
Is this the end for Robert Mugabe? Because we are reporting about this possible transitional government right now.
So we're not sure. People have called this a soft coup. It's not. He hasn't been sent into exile. He hasn't been arrested. He hasn't been shot or executed. So he's still part of the scene. And I think what is probably going to happen is some kind of negotiation where maybe he stays on in some capacity, although I think Zimbabweans will be very reluctant to see that. Remember, the ZANU-PF Extraordinary Conference is coming up in December, and so there may, I think that's an important factor that needs to be taken into account as how this plays. South Africa has sent envoys on behalf of SADC to try and see what's going to happen. I think if they try and reverse this and say it's business as usual, I don't think that's going to fly with the military. But as to his role and whether, you're reporting he's going to be able to negotiate an exit, that's a better position than if he really was being put in prison or exiled or worse.
How is this military takeover, for now, let's call it that, going to affect Zimbabwe's international standing, its international relations, as well as its economic standing?
So they're very reluctant to call it a coup, but it has all the hallmarks of a coup.
It walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck.
Exactly. So, but they're reluctant to use that word because, as I said, that then would, for example, result in automatic suspension from the African Union. It would result in problems in SADC. So, I think Zimbabwe is going to be internally focused on this. So, in terms of its international relations, I don't think that's going to be where the energy of the country is put. It's really going to be looking at its own problems. It'll be very interesting to see what SADC says. We heard from your correspondents that they were meeting late into the night. What I find interesting is that in this talk of a transitional government, that they're talking about a multi-party government, whereas for me yesterday it really looked like this was going to be within the party. So we'll have to see how this plays out in the coming days. But the longer there is no political solution, the more under pressure Zimbabwe is going to be from SADC and from the African Union.
Politically, was this the correct thing for the president, Jacob Zuma, to send an envoy to Zimbabwe as the head of SADC?
Absolutely. I think the fact that South Africa acted very swiftly and within the ambit of SADC was expected. This is a real crisis, and yes, I think credit to the South African government. I'm not sure whether we'll see whether the mediators or the envoys were the right ones, but interesting that he didn't send the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that we've sent the Minister of State Security, and we've sent the Minister of Defense. So it's been looked at through a kind of security lens rather than through a political lens. And South Africa is obviously concerned. This is our biggest neighbor, and we have a long border with Zimbabwe, and we already host many Zimbabwean migrants. If this were to turn very violent very quickly and people were to flee, we would be dealing with a refugee problem.
And that will be the impact on South Africa then, of course. But in the end, the military intervention right now, will that sort of stabilize the political situation in Zimbabwe and bring stability?
It's hard to say at the moment. I think, we've got to separate what's going to happen in the next 24 to 48 hours as to what's going to happen over the next week and the next month. I mean, your report also showed, and we saw the visuals of the streets of Harare are quiet. People are going about their business. They're not quite sure of what to make of it. And I think it was very carefully planned. I think, we didn't see shots fired and tanks blowing up State House. It seems to be a surgical strike almost by the military.
Now, just briefly, because we're running out of time, we saw SADC react, but the AU was very quiet on this issue.
Well, there was a statement this morning, and generally what happens is they use a big word and they call it the principle of subsidiarity, which means that the institution that's closest regionally should take the lead. So there's no question that SADC will work closely with the AU. AU, but it's SADC in the first instance is going to handle this crisis. If it needs help, it needs assistance, it needs envoys from the AU, they will be called in, but SADC will handle this.
Mr. Graz, thank you so much for your time and joining us here in studio.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Now, there you have it. That was the head of Governance and Foreign Policy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Stephen Graz, here in studio. Now, we're asking you that question. It's a very important question because I'd like to focus on Zimbabwe. We continue from yesterday on this particular issue. There it is. What led to Mugabe's downfall? That is the president of Zimbabwe. What led to that? I'd like to get your thoughts on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom as well as on the Facebook page. Let's take a look at what you are telling me in my ear. This one coming from Ando says, because the reasoning behind the perpetrators' actions and the impact of it. Now, let me see if I can get that one. Ando is gone. So let's start with this one from NDF. He says, Robert Mugabe spent his time studying an array of disciplines, and this made him a jack of all and master of none. This cultivated a great deal of egoism in him, and he became someone who doesn't take advice from anyone. He turned himself into a villain and an enemy of the people, says MDF. Michael Big M Satole says, obviously a woman by the name of Grace. She created factions within ZANU-PF by being power hungry. We may not like Uncle Bob, but when you force out a dog, be sure that you're not inviting a wolf. Saddam and Gaddafi both fell, and look at Iraq and Libya today. Hashtag food for thought. He says it's all about a woman. Dr. Moses Villani says Africa's old tendency by leaders of clinging onto power for far too long, says Dr. Moses Villani. Well, you can keep them coming. We'll read them as we continue. We'll also get back to that story, but coming back home a little bit. A legal battle is looming between lawyers representing Madiba's former wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and the executors of the late President Nelson Mandela's will. Madikizela Mandela has approached the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein to overturn a 2016 decision by the Mthatha High Court, which dismissed her application to acquire Madiba's home at Kunu in the Eastern Cape. Madikizela Mandela maintains in court papers that the property is hers. She says the former Land Affairs Minister, Derek Hanekom, didn't consult her when donating the land to Madiba in 1997. She claims that the property was built on land allocated to her in 1989. The Royal House of Mandela previously rejected Madikizela Mandela's claim of the property to the property, saying that Madiba had wished that the Kunu residence be managed by the executors of his estate. The executors of Mandela's estate will argue in the High Court that Mandela's will clearly states that the property should be administered by the family trust. The National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union has condemned the transporting of corpses using an open trailer in Johannesburg yesterday. Now, 42 bodies in coffins fell onto the M1 South Highway after a private undertaker's trailer lost one of its wheels. The trailer was carrying the 16 adult corpses and 26 stillborn babies from the Charlotte Maxeke Hospital to a cemetery in Eldorado Park for a pauper's burial. The union says it blames this gruesome act on the outsourcing of key government functions to the private sector. The Gauteng Health Department said it regrets that the incident took place and will investigate further. Absolutely atrocious, isn't it? I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well. But let's now take a look at what's trending on social media. We start with that story, hashtag dead bodies. That investigation is now underway into how 42 corpses were being transported in an open trailer. The wheel of that trailer dislodged and got stuck on the M1 South in Johannesburg. The bodies were being transported from Charlotte Maxeke Hospital to the Olifantsvlei Cemetery for a pauper's burial. Johannesburg Metro Police say the driver of that trailer did not have any documentation proving that they are a registered mortuary or any hospital documentation to move the bodies. And then moving on to hashtag Zimbabwe, the future of the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, remains uncertain as the country's military continues to hold him under house arrest. Now, for many Zimbabweans, his possible departure from office is being welcomed. But negotiations are now taking place both within the country and in neighboring Botswana. Moving further afield, in a surprise move, France was announced as the host of the Rugby World Cup in 2023. There you see it, following that announcement by World Rugby in London. Ireland, South Africa and France were the three nations vying to host the Rugby World Cup, and the decision comes as a shock to many South Africans. Hashtag Rugby World Cup 2023. Now we have the stadiums, and look at those tears. Those tears are crying foul. There's a lot of questions around that bid process, I tell you. Our picture of the day comes from @Mo1. Says President Mugabe and Mnangagwa before things went sour in the bush. There you have it, General Tongo and Mnangagwa. But there they are. Happy times, wasn't it? Our comment of the day comes from Tau Mojo to the Zimbabwean military. President Mugabe and the people of Zimbabwe show the world that you can resolve your country's internal conflicts without any bloodshed. Well, there you have it. These are some of the social media trends. You can keep them coming. We'll read them as we continue. That's the comments on the question that we have for you. But we'll take a short break. And when we return, we'll have the theme of the day.
An exciting opportunity and an absolute must for those with the spirit of adventure is a Kruger Park night game drive.
The railway station itself is already a sight to behold and offers gracious colonial-style buildings and serves as the departure and arrival point for all train journeys.
I wanted to dress with my best color. Being awarded to do the Serpentine Pavilion is the highest commission in my career. And I wanted just to come and show me with my best clothes, and that is blue.
Catch Trains Travel every Sunday from 12 to 1 for all the global travel and leisure trends.
I told you, when you come back, or when we come back, we're going to give you our theme for the day. We're looking at copper theft in South Africa. Now, South Africa is facing a major problem with copper theft. The scourge is escalating and has a negative ripple effect on almost all walks of life. Communication networks, electricity supply to businesses and homes are all affected. Railways, roads, you mentioned. It's estimated that losses due to copper theft in the country is more than 5 billion rand per year. Think about that. The City of Joburg spokesperson Lucky Sindani now joins us in studio as we look into the latest investigations here in the City of Joburg. Mr. Sindani, a very good morning to you, sir, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
First and foremostly, how far are you with your investigations as the city in relation to the copper theft that you've uncovered a couple of weeks ago?
You're referring to the one that was stolen in the inner city?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What we did with the one that was uncovered in the inner city, we arrested 3 scrapyard owners. Investigations are still ongoing. The case, the people has been in court. They've appeared in the Johannesburg Magistrates Court. So what I want us to talk about is the one that we lost at the weekend. Our nerve center, IT nerve center, was broken into at the weekend. We received a call on Saturday morning that our nerve center was broken into. Now, this is where we store our data. This is our data center. Our data.
Is that data center for the city?
For the city of Johannesburg. Data and the disaster recovery center for the city of Johannesburg. Thieves made off with the cables of worth 2 million. But
was this an in-charge job?
It was an inside job.
How do you know?
we offered a reward of 100,000 rand, like we did with the previous bust in September. Someone gave us information yesterday. All I can tell you is that investigations are at an advanced stage. We expected to make arrests either today, the team is going there today or tomorrow.
Okay.
All I can tell you is that people that are behind this will be behind bars before the end of the week, and it is people that we are working with. Now, this is a sabotage to the city because we are in the process of building a data center, so that we don't depend on service providers. We're building it at the cost of 35 million. We're spending 6 million a month in paying service providers. That's from security, from hosting our server, and all those things. So we want to minimize that and host it ourselves. So people who did this want to delay that process. They want to delay us. We were going to go live in December, but luckily enough, no damage was done as a result of the cables that were stolen at the weekend. They thought that major damage would be done, but our inspectors came on site and the engineers inspected the damage that was done as a result, because the cables were ripped from generators, brand new generators. No damage was done, and we are gonna go live.
Now, there's a couple of questions here, because it would seem that if there's somebody that want to delay the process, then that somebody will benefit from it, and that would point a finger to your service providers.
Service providers, but there's quite a number of them. When you say service providers, we can also talk about security. Security.
Let's talk about the security first, because you had security on site. The guards were on duty. Are these guards that were there from the inception, and are they aware of what is currently happening?
We're puzzled. There were supposed to be 5 guards on the night guarding the place, but there was no one when this happened. So one of the guards did his rounds, and then he went to sleep at another building. So there was no one guarding. So these people had ample time to do whatever that they did during the early hours of that night, the morning, sorry. We viewed the footage as well, because we obtained footage from the building, from our buildings, from facilities management, and that is why we're saying that we are confident that it is people from inside.
Very convenient that the guard had to go sleep in another building, but that put aside. Now, the theft of, or the break-in, so to speak, and the 35 million project, how much has that set you back, and are you still online to finish off the project in December?
No, we're online. Luckily, it didn't set us back. Everything is in order. We will complete our project by December. That is why they thought they were sabotaging us, but nothing. No damage was caused to the generators that these cables were connected to. And these generators are imported. So imagine if these generators were damaged. Now, the cost thereof, bringing an engineer or buying new generators that are imported. You know,
So there's a tender for a generator perhaps out there waiting.
Yeah. Copper cable theft, sets us back big time as a city. I mean, as a city, for an example, we lost cables with 2 million, 15 million the inner city. But to repair these costs us 60 million a year. 60 million a year.
Can this be curbed? And what will happen now, especially the building where the break-in was for the data building? Are you going to secure it even more? Will you use sophisticated electronic equipment to capture everything and make sure that it's secure?
It is. We are going to up our security in that building. It's a pity that we thought that the security measures that we had in place are sufficient, but it turned out they were not. So we will increase the number of security and cameras around that area, because the people who were working there, the contractor that's on site, they were also supposed to install cameras. They installed cameras, but then they were not connected.
Also convenient. Now, in closing, total cost to the city of Joburg in relation to copper theft, and what is your message out there, and are you doing something about that? Because it costs billions of rands per year.
On security, we spend about 76 million a year on security. And can you imagine that these are the people also that we entrust to guard our infrastructure, and at the end of the day, we get disappointed, that they guard this infrastructure, but people come and steal once they are there. Our message to them out there is that their days are numbered. We are coming for them as the city's Group Forensic and Investigation Unit. We are coming for thieves. Gone are the days where thieves used to do as they please in the streets of Johannesburg.
Mr. Sindani, I thank you
so much.
and all the best of luck with the process.
Thank you so much.
That was City of Joburg spokesperson Lucky Sindani. It's an ongoing problem. It cost them a lot of money. It cost you and me living in this city a lot of money. So if you know about Isinyoka, report them. Now, South Africa. Now, we know that we are conducting this poll here today, and we're asking you, should cable theft be declared an economic crime? Maybe, Mr. Sindani, you can tell us, because so far we have 287 votes in, and 92% of our people in South Africa, as well as the continent of Africa, are suggesting that it should be an economic crime. Only 8% are saying no. Do you think that that should be the case?
It should be, because it sabotages the economy. Businesses lose out as a result of copper cable theft. I mean, look at the one that happened in the inner city.
Yes.
Businesses were not operating for weeks.
Yes. Mr. Sindani, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, South Africa is facing that major problem with copper theft. We know that, and it has a negative impact on all of us as citizens. It is not only the city of Joburg or Johannesburg that is affected. Cable theft has cost the eThekwini municipality. They lose about 60 million rand, which has impacted the city's communication network, the electricity supply, as well as their railway and their traffic services. Copper cable holds a high monetary value and can be sold for 65 to 70 rand per kilogram. The municipality has adopted a project of zero tolerance to cable theft. The acting head of electricity in the eThekwini municipality, Max Mthembu, now joins us from our Durban studios. Mr. Mthembu, very good morning to you and welcome.
Good morning, sir, and thank you for inviting me to a program.
Now, we mentioned some numbers there in relation to what it costs, but how big is cable and copper theft in the eThekwini municipality, and how has it affected all your operations in the city?
It is really big, actually. Similar to Johannesburg story, we're experiencing the same things. But you must remember, there are categories of these problems that we're experiencing within the eThekwini municipality.
What are those categories?
There are people who are stealing simply because they want to electrify themselves illegally. But there are also people who are stealing because they're in the business of stealing, and they're selling this copper theft to the industry through scrapyards and throughout the world. But let's take the first instance where people are stealing because they want to electrify. That one we've been able to cap as a city within the eThekwini municipality, because we have now gone through on our own to electrify all the informal settlements. You must understand this. In the informal settlement, in any informal settlement, you will find that there are about 3 or 4 people who are stealing electricity. Not everybody in that settlement are stealing. They have their mini municipalities or mini ESCOM in those areas. So whenever we come and we remove the services through illegal connections that are there, those are the 3 people or 4 people are affected. They go out and then steal our infrastructure so that they can replace the infrastructure for their customers in the informal settlements. So those ones were killing that business slowly as the municipality because we are now electrifying. And those are the people who are giving us a hard time electrifying those informal settlements. But yes, slowly we are winning the parity within the eThekwini municipality.
Mr. Mthembu, the infrastructure that you've put into the informal settlements, what does that entail? Is it prepaid or is it the normal electricity that people would normally receive?
We go for prepaid. Actually, we have gone to the point of saying all the informal settlements are now going to be supplying them at a 20 amp supply. The 20 amps is just the amount of electricity that we push through, the number of amps that we give to each and every shack within the city. And it's a free installation to the customer, but it is costing the municipality a lot of money to put it in them. They only pay for the consumption that they use. So it's only prepaid. We don't give anything other than a prepaid service.
Now, you have now put in a system called Zero Tolerance to Cable Theft Project. Has it paid off?
Come again?
That program that you've adopted, the Zero Tolerance Cable Theft Project, has it paid off? And what is your success rate thus far?
Actually, there is a success rate on that program. What we've done on the high voltage network, we've put in a lot of our money as an investment so that we can be able to keep and detect any stealing happening in that kind of infrastructure. And for the past 2 years, we've experienced zero rate of stealing at the high voltage level. The only problems we're experiencing within the city is the people who are digging the city everywhere and they damage our cables every time they dig. But other than that, the people who have been stealing our towers and our lines, we've been able to keep that stealing at the high voltage lines. But the problem still remains at the low voltage of our network, where people are stealing the street light cables and are stealing all other networks which are copper related. But the way that we've done, we've replaced all the copper within the city with aluminium. But look, the customers or the people who are stealing, they don't know that now there is aluminium, no copper. So they still go out there and steal that aluminium. But after 2 attempts, they found that they can't buy it, they can't sell it to anyone. Then they stop in those areas, they move to other areas. As they steal, we replace all the copper wires with aluminium, so the stealing gets reduced. Every moment they steal and we come and replace.
Now in Johannesburg, they've arrested a number of metal dealers or scrap metal dealers. Have you done the same there? And have you closed them down, so to speak, in order to curb the stealing of copper cables?
No, we do not close them. We don't have a right to close them. But we are in engagements with all the copper scrap dealers within eThekwini. So they now know whenever they see our cable, we give them a samples of our cable. They now know whenever they see those cables, what they are supposed to do with us. We call police together. We're having a joint venture with SABC within eThekwini, plus those scrap yards and our guys. We're always on the lookout. We have a team that we assembled within eThekwini. We've employed about 20 people that are dealing exactly with it, who are just going around the whole of eThekwini just to check and deal with SABC. Together with them, we're able to jail a lot of people. Actually, we've jailed a lot. We've got a lot of success stories up to so far within eThekwini municipality.
I thank you so much for your time and good luck with the project, sir. That was the acting head of electricity in eThekwini municipality, Maxwell Mthembu, from our Durban studios. Well, that's where we got to leave it for now. There's a question regarding this, and of course you can participate in that poll, but we'll come back to it. Meanwhile, there's a legal battle which is looming between lawyers representing Madiba's former wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and the executors of the late President Nelson Mandela's will. Let's go there live to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein.
So, is your submission that in regard to determining whether there's an unreasonable delay and whether there should be condemnation is the same under the common law and under PAJA, except that under PAJA there is a distinction in regard to the relevance of the merits, in other words, the way in which you approach the merits?
That is so, Justice Wayne. The curiosity in the judgment is that even though the court finds that PAJA applies, the test, as the court uses or invokes, is actually the common law test. So in other words, it goes into the first leg, it goes into the second leg and into the merits of the matter.
But isn't that so? Because basically PAJA sought to codify the law in regard to judicial review. So obviously the issue of unreasonableness is the same for the common law or for PAJA.
Yes.
But in your heads, you seem to concentrate on Paja in paragraph 13.
Yes,
and there's no attention given to a common law review.
That is so, Justice Swain, but our submission before you is that the court erred in finding that Paja applies, that in line of the long line of cases and decisions of this court, and specifically cases like the Bullock case, that in fact, if the decision was made before Paja was promulgated, that in fact Paja does not apply.
You see, the reason that it concerns me, this distinction, in a very recent decision of this court in Mostert versus Registrar of Pension Funds, this court, in dealing with the common law review and a review under Paja, in fact pointed out that there is a distinction between the two forms of review. In paragraph 34, the approach under Paja to a delay is not the same as under the common law. Under the common law, a court may refuse to hear a review if there has been an unreasonable delay in instituting the proceedings. What would constitute an unreasonable delay would depend on the circumstances. And then they go on to deal with Section 7 of Paja in regard to the finding that a delay past 180 days is per se unreasonable.
Yes.
So that decision seems to draw a distinction between a common law review and Paja in regard to the assessment of whether there's been an unreasonable delay.
And we would support that, Justice Swain, that in relation to the common law review, that the test is different than what it is under Paja.
So is your argument then based solely on the common law?
On the common law review.
That is your submission that Paja doesn't apply?
That is so, because the decision was made before Paja was promulgated.
There seemed to have been a factor here in regard to whether the action was instituted before Paja. In Associated Institutions Pension Fund, the action was instituted before Paja and the decision was taken before Paja, but it seems to be clear, and do you agree with that interpretation, that in this court, in that case, found the decision to be the relevant aspect?
We agree with that, Justice Swain. In fact, this court did it in Bullock as well, Bullock versus Provincial Government Northwest, where the critical date was the date of the decision.
So your submission is we're not concerned with Paja in this appeal?
We submit
it's a common law review.
That's so. If I can then go straight, in the light of that discussion, into the first leg of the argument, and that's the question of whether or not there was an unreasonable delay. Now, we submit that, and there's a line of authority for this proposition, that in fact the first leg is a value judgment, and therefore the test on appeal would be the straightforward test.
Yes, but it's a factual inquiry.
It's a factual inquiry.
With a value judgment on those facts.
That's correct.
It's not a discretion.
It's not an exercise of a discretion, and therefore the principles which would apply to when a court interferes in the exercise of the discretion won't apply to the first leg. In fact, Justice Shongwe, it would only apply in relation to the second leg, and that's whether or not the delay should be condoned. And so we draw that distinction, the first leg from the second leg, simply because it changes the grounds on which the court can interfere with the decision.
So your submission is the factual finding on the unreasonable delay this court can interfere with?
It just uses the straightforward appeal test. It's only in relation to the second leg that the question of discretion and the extent to which the court will interfere with the exercise of the discretion becomes relevant.
So on the first leg, we're looking whether there's a material discretion or we believe that the court quo was wrong.
Was wrong. That's correct, Justice.
See, a particular issue that concerns me in regard to the first leg is it seems that the reason put forward by the appellant for the delay is that she only found out about it when the late President Mandela's will was read.
That's correct.
Now, do you accept that in order for her to ascertain when the decision was taken, that the provision in Paja, which is a codification of the common law, which provides in section 7.1, subsection 1b, it says for when the time starts running, became aware of the action and the reasons for it, or might reasonably have been expected to have become aware of the action and the reasons.
Yes.
Do you accept that in this case, in order to determine when the appellant ought to have become aware of the decision, one applies the test of reasonableness? In other words, if she had taken reasonable care, could she have become aware of the decision at a stage earlier than when the will was read?
We accept that, Justice Swain, but I think the starting position is the following, and it's a very relevant factor as to when she in fact acquired knowledge. Now we do, and we will address you on the reasonable aspect and when she ought reasonably to have become aware. But we emphasize the starting point is when did she in fact become aware? And is there any dispute around when she acquired knowledge of the decision?
Well, there is no dispute on the papers.
There is no dispute.
Yes.
And the court accepted, in
Yes.
fact, that she only became aware upon the death of Mr.
But is
Mandela.
there anything wrong with the way in which the court phrased the inquiry in paragraph 25 of the judgment at page 705? And where it says, the first question is whether, as a fact, Mrs. Mandela unreasonably delayed the launch of these proceedings. Mrs. Mandela stated that she only became aware of the registration of the property in the name of Mr. Mandela, and therefore the minister's decision after the death of Mr. Mandela when she became aware of the contents of his will. This was not denied by the executors of the minister. And then they phrase the question is when a reasonable person in the shoes of Mrs. Mandela would have acquired knowledge of the minister's decision. Do you have any quarrel with that formulation?
We don't have quarrel with the formulation of the test at this stage, Justice Swain. What we do take issue with is how the test was implemented. In other words, how the court conducted the inquiry.
In other words, on the evidence?
On the evidence, that's correct.
So in other words, you accept that that is the test in order to determine whether she should have acquired knowledge at an earlier stage?
We accept that the court was entitled to look into whether she exercised reasonable care. Yes. In finding out about the existence of the decision.
So your quarrel with the court quo's finding is that on the evidence, it should not have found that by the exercise of reasonable care, she would have become aware at an earlier stage.
That is our submission.
Ms. Pillay, lest I be lost in the questions and answer method, would it be possibly proper if you were to give us your submissions?
Thank you.
And as we go along, we can put questions to you.
I'm grateful for that, Justice Matopa, and I'll proceed to do that.
And taking into account what my brother Swain has put to you.
Yes, I will definitely. Thank you for that,
because the same concern that he raised, I share.
Yes. If I can then turn to what I've done, I'm going to take 2 steps back, Justice Swain, you'll forgive me, just to place some structure on the submissions. If I can take 2 steps back and then start dealing with the first leg and the question of whether there was unreasonable delay. Now, we've made the submission, and it's, of course, it's not disputed that Mrs. Mandela only became aware that the property had been disposed of at the time of Mr. Mandela's death, when the contents of the will became known to her, and that we submit that on its own, this is a crucial fact to take into account in deciding whether there was unreasonable delay. This is different from other cases where there were question marks about whether they had full knowledge at the time, whether they acquired knowledge later on. In this case, it's crystal clear, and everyone agrees, that she only became aware at a very late stage after Mr. Mandela's death. Now, this court has previously accepted that a delay caused by a lack of knowledge, was reasonable. And I refer you to the Prime Media case. It's 2017, Volume 1, 572 SCA. And in this case, this was the case brought by SANEF with the signal jamming that was done in Parliament. And what SANEF did when it arrived in this court is it sought to set aside the parliamentary broadcasting policy. And that was done in 2014. And one of the issues raised by Parliament is that SANEF was aware, at least since 2009, of the existence of the policy, or at least that the policy was in existence since 2009, and therefore SANEF ought to have known that the policy was in existence. And this court found that the mere fact that SANEF did not know about the policy, notwithstanding the fact that the policy had been in existence at that stage for a number of years, was sufficient to show that the delay was not unreasonable, the delay in challenging the policy.
Yes, but that turned particularly on the facts. What was the delay there? It was only, 2 or 3 years?
Well, Justice Swain, it was from 2009 to 2014.
Right,
yeah.
So 5 years.
It was a 5-year delay. And the court found, the critical point which we seek to draw to the attention of the court, is that the court found that the mere absence of knowledge was sufficient to show that the delay was not unreasonable.
But the issue of reasonable care wasn't investigated there.
It was not dealt with there,
yes.
Although the argument raised by Parliament, Justice Swain, was that they ought to have known of the existence of the policy because they chose to broadcast within Parliament. And notwithstanding that, that raises the question of reasonable care. Notwithstanding that, the court found that, in fact, they did not know, and that was a relevant factor in deciding whether or not there was unreasonable delay. Now, we have indicated in the earlier question and answer interlude with Justice Swain that our argument is really this, that based on the facts which the court took into account, that the finding that in fact there was unreasonable delay was erroneous. And this court will note that the entire discussion in the judgment of the court of law happens in one paragraph, and it happens in paragraph 26 of the judgment. Now, if the court has regard to paragraph 26 of the judgment, which is at page 705 of volume 5, the court will see that what the court of court took into
That's the legal battle over Madiba's home in Kunu. That's continuing. We're going to go back there shortly, but let me remind you of your top stories here at 10:00 hours Central Africa time on the Newsroom. Zimbabwe is likely to have a transitional government following yesterday's army takeover. The National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union has condemned the transporting of corpses using an open trailer in Johannesburg yesterday. And a legal battle is currently underway between the lawyers representing Madiba's former wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and the executors of the late President Nelson Mandela's will. Talking about that, let's go there, back live.
But isn't that, in the bigger scheme of things, another factor that may be taken or that militates against the acceptance of a version? Because, as you would appreciate, if you are to assess and evaluate whether there has been unreasonable delay or not, it's an exercise that is not done in a vacuum.
Yes.
All the factors have to be taken into account.
We accept that.
If, as the Court of Court said, the quarrel that you have with it in respect of this paragraph, one has to take the circumstances of the case, all the factors, into the pot.
Yes.
And decide whether, as at that time, she could have, by due or reasonable care, have ascertained the circumstances that are now sought to be impugned.
Justice Matopa, what the Court of Law found, and this is the point that we take issue with, is that somehow Mrs. Mandela's enjoyment and use of the property was interfered with. In other words, that she didn't have open access to the property, and therefore she ought to have known that the property had been transferred into the personal name of Mr. Mandela. And we say that's simply not borne out by the evidence.
Ms. Pillay, I accept that on the evidence, the notion that Mrs. Mandela was excluded doesn't seem to be borne out by the record. But what does not seem to be disputed is that the late Mr. Mandela used this property with his third wife, Ms. Michelle.
Yes.
Now, was it remotely consistent with the customary right which the appellant had in this property that Mr. Mandela should have had use of it with his third wife? Because this was the second wife's allotment, according to the appellant.
Yes.
It appears to me quite inconsistent.
Well, Justice Rogers, the facts are that, of course, Mr. Mandela visited the property with his third wife, right? And that's clear. But what's also...
And also he had determined what was built there. First, I think there was the Victor Verster replica house. Am I right that then an even more elaborate house was built?
Yes, that's correct. There were extensions to the property.
Yes. And the evidence suggests that that was really treated as the place where the late Mr. Mandela and Ms. Michelle went when they were in the Transkei.
Well, we would submit, Justice Rogers, that what the evidence shows is that both Mr. and Mrs. Mandela had open access to Kunu. There's absolutely no evidence that she was prevented from visiting Kunu at any time. And similarly, there's no evidence that Mr. Mandela and Mrs. Michelle were prevented from accessing Kunu.
But is it consistent with the customary right? As I understand it, the notion of the customary right is that the first wife has an allotment, and then your client says a second wife gets one. Now there's a third wife.
Yeah.
why is the third wife using the property, even if it is as the partner to Mr. Mandela?
We would submit, Justice Rogers, that that's just the way it was.
Well, the question is whether the way it was something which should have alerted your client, the appellant, to making inquiries. You know, was there conduct which appeared to be inconsistent with what she claimed were her customary rights?
No, we would submit, Justice Rogers, the fact that there was open and equal access by Mr. Mandela and his third wife and by Mrs. Mandela would in no way have raised the red flag for her that there was some covert disposal of the property to Mr. Mandela. There was absolutely no basis for her to suspect that that had taken place. She had free reign, free access to Kunu.
Is that really a credible submission? Because all the evidence suggests that as early as April 1992, your client and Mr. Mandela had separated. We have Mr. Mandela's affidavit in the divorce proceedings, which says that he hasn't spoken with her for some years now. So this was not an amicable relationship. And then he gets married to Ms. Michelle. Is it plausible that your client, having this property, as she says, as her property, as the second wife, would have tolerated that use of the property by the third wife in those circumstances, unless she accepted that she didn't have exclusive rights to the property and that it wasn't in fact hers?
Well, Justice Rogers, Mrs. Mandela has never sought to enforce exclusive rights to the property, and I think that's where our submission lies. She has never stated that Kunu was only and exclusively for her use. Her position has always been that this is the second wife's house, but that in a sense, both her and Mr. Mandela enjoy informal rights to the house. And therefore, that when Mr. Mandela comes to the homestead with his new wife, what would have raised the red flag for Mrs. Mandela was if she was prevented from entering the home. That would have been a cause for concern for her. Well, I'm not welcome here, something has changed. But that never happened. In fact, the contrary happened. Every time she wished to visit the home, she did, and that's undisputed on the papers. So there was...
Yes, there's no... Unfortunately, the evidence is rather vague as to how often that happened.
Yes.
And the onus was on your client to establish, ultimately, that there wasn't an unreasonable delay. Yes. But she doesn't give evidence or particulars of how often she utilized the property.
But she does state, Justice Rogers, she does state that every time she wished to visit Kunu, she did. And there is absolutely no evidence on the papers that she was in any way prevented from doing so. And that, for us, is a key submission. There is not an iota of evidence on the papers that Mrs. Mandela's use of the property was interfered with. And for us, that would have been the red flag.
You know, my worry is, she tells us in the affidavit that years ago, Mrs. Mandela's mother told her that as a second wife, she had to get her own house. And years later, she's divorced, and Miss Gracia Machel is now the third wife. And Gracia Machel is now frequenting her house, which she had been told years back, make sure that you have your own house. And there is somebody in her house. And then she keeps quiet. And there is no iota of evidence from her affidavit that says, I did protest to say, this is my house. Why are you bringing Ms. Gracia Machel to my house?
Quite simply, Justice Matopa, because what's clear is that it was the understanding that both of them had equal access to Kunu.
Well, there's no evidence that that was an understanding. The only evidence is that it happened and your client did nothing about it.
That's correct. But we would submit that if the inquiry that this court is facing is whether or not she ought reasonably to have known that something as drastic as a disposal of the customary land took place.
Well, sorry.
I don't think we get there yet. We get there where we have to establish whether her inaction in any way had any material part to play.
You see, this is not only a case of the property being used after an acrimonious divorce by the third wife in the company of the late Mr. Mandela. But it's also a case, there might be a factual dispute about it, but that has to be resolved in favour of the other side on the Plascon-Evans test, that the first house and then the grander extensions were all undertaken by Mr. Mandela at a time when he no longer had any relationship with your client.
Well, again,
and I know your client says, well, it's the responsibility of the husband in a customary marriage to do that. But I mean, we're not talking about strict technical rights. We're talking about the conduct of reasonable people. Is it reasonable that in this separated state, and when Mr. Mandela has now entered into a relationship with Ms. Michelle and is extending the house without any reference to your client, that it would not have occurred to your client that she needs to take some steps, as it were, to assert her rights and to question his?
Justice Rogers, we would submit that the question is that at the time, and I must make the submission that a lot of the extensions happened while the parties were married.
Well,
and then some of it happened later.
I understand that the Victor Verster house was built between 93 and 95.
Yes.
By which stage your client and Mr. Mandela had separated and hadn't spoken to each other for some time.
But that was.
And bear in mind, your client later in the divorce claimed 50% of his estate.
Yes, but the civil divorce we're saying is entirely irrelevant to the discussion.
But how can that be? Surely, if your client believed that she had a claim to that property, and in the divorce she had a counterclaim for one half of the late President Mandela's proprietary assets, and the divorce goes by and she knows she's not obtained any order in regard to the proprietary consequences of the marriage. Now, surely, if this was so important to her and she owned that property, wouldn't a reasonable person at that stage have said, well, look, hang on, what has happened about my customary claim to the property?
Justice Swain, one of these submissions we make, and perhaps I should address this at this stage, and I'm going to have to take 2 steps back and build the submission because I think it's quite a crucial one to come to grips with. And that's to refer the court to the Constitutional Court's decision of MM versus MN. And it's referred to in our heads of argument. And I do so, and I'm going to take some time just to take you through some of the factors which the court identified in the MM case, because I think it's crucial to coming to grips with the interplay between the civil law and the customary law.
Sorry, where is it in your heads? What's the reference?
The citation is 2013, Volume 4, SA 415CC. And I'll give you the reference, 415CC. And I just want to read an excerpt of the decision in MM, which is in our heads of argument. And I'll give you the reference. I'm just arguing from an oral note. I'll give you the reference to the heads of argument in a few minutes. But what the Constitutional Court said is the following. This court has, in a number of decisions, explained that this resurrection of customary law to its rightful place as one of the primary sources of law under the Constitution means, and it says that this includes that, 1, customary law must be understood in its own terms and not through the lens of the common law. And that's, for us,
No, but
it's
I
a
understand
crucial
that.
submission.
Yes, I understand that, and I respect that. But the fact is, we're talking about the conduct of your client. Obviously, her customary law rights were very important to her.
That's
on the
correct.
papers.
Yes.
Now, what I'm saying is that a reasonable person who such a right is very important to them, after the divorce is finalised, where her proprietary claim, she gets nothing. Surely, at that stage, she would have asserted and found out. And I'm aware of the error of the court quo that, in fact, the land was only donated to Mr. Mandela a year after the divorce.
That's correct.
But with that knowledge and how important it was to her for 17 years, to at no stage assert or ask what was happening about her customary law rights to the property. That's what concerns me.
Justice Swain, we would submit that she had no reason to. That the customary law arrangement in relation to Kudu stood separate from the civil marriage and the civil divorce. And therefore, the property at Punu didn't feature at all in the civil divorce.
Yes, but is that in the real world, when there is a divorce and she's counterclaiming for half of his estate, in the real world, is she just going to say, oh, well, I think this divorce is not going to have any effect on my customary marriage and I don't need to talk about Kunu because quite evidently both of us understand that that remains my and that Mr. Mandela is going to carry on being married to me by customary law, even though he later enters into a marriage with another woman, and in that sense follows a polygamous lifestyle. Is that real?
Justice Rogers, I can't answer about what's real, but I can tell you what happened in Mrs. Mandela's world. And I can tell you what happened in the world of the Mandela elders and in the community of Qunu. They considered the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Mandela very real and very alive.
Is there any evidence that that was their view at any time after the divorce?
Well,
we've got lots of evidence about the allocation of the land in 89 and 90 and the extension in 94, 95, which is slightly less satisfactory. But is there any evidence that they just continued to accept and was accepted in the broader community that this marriage still existed?
Well, the evidence, the affidavits that are filed, Justice Rogers, were filed in 2014.
Yes.
And in those affidavits, all of the Qunu members, the elders of the Abatembu, as well as the leaders, state that in their view, she's the wife, the customary law wife of Mr. Mandela.
Yes, they say that that is their understanding of customary law, but is there any evidence that anybody ever attached reality to that before Mr. Mandela died and the rights to this property became an issue?
Justice Rogers, with respect, our submission is that the customary marriage is the reality. That is the reality of the community. That is the reality of Mrs. Mandela. When the elders of the Abatembu community come to court and say in affidavits that we considered this that Mrs. Mandela is the customary law wife of Mr. Mandela, that is their reality.
But in the counterclaim, in the divorce proceedings, was that asserted?
I'm sorry, Justice Shangwe.
The fact that the customary union was the main marriage, was that asserted in the counterclaim by Mrs. Mandela?
No, as our submission is that the proceedings before court, the civil divorce, focused purely and squarely on the civil marriage.
Yes.
That the customary marriage didn't feature in those proceedings at all.
It didn't feature at all, but I mean, these are the people who are saying now that the customary union was the marriage. In other words, the civil marriage did not make any difference to the customary union.
Well,
but was it clearly put in the counterclaim that this is the position?
Justice Shangwe, what the elders are saying in their affidavits is that they consider that Mrs. Mandela is the wife, the customary law wife of Mr. Mandela.
Yes, but she then participates in the divorce.
That's correct.
And she puts in a counterclaim, and she becomes aware thereafter that nothing was said about the property. In terms of that divorce, she didn't go to court and apply for a rescission or the appointment of a liquidator in order to include the question of the property.
Because our submission, Justice Shangwe, is that Qunu didn't feature in the civil marriage. Because the regime that regulated her access to Qunu, her allotment, was a customary law regime.
But now in that customary marriage or made customary custom with the Qunu property, was it for her exclusive use or for her family?
We submit that it wasn't, and she says it extensively on the papers, Justice Mokholwa, that it wasn't an exclusive right.
But it goes back to what my brother Matupa asked you, that if it was for her, it was allocated to her because of what the mother-in-law said. Why did he allow the third wife to come and stay in the same house with her?
Well, we would submit that that's just what happened factually, that both of them had unimpeded access to Qunu.
And when he saw all the extension of the property and the building of the property without her participating, she never had a problem with it.
Well, certain aspects of the extensions she participated in, and she was involved in it, and later she wasn't.
But it said, in the papers they say that it was the NMR Trust who was doing that through the...
The legal battle continues there with Madiba's house in Qunu. But right now, we're going to break away a little bit and go now live to a cabinet briefing where the situation in Zimbabwe might be discussed.
Coming on other decisions on under appeals,
Cabinet approved the publication of a notice in terms of Section 74, subsection 5 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa of 1996. The aim is to initiate a national and provincial consultation process for purposes of effecting changes to provincial boundaries in respect to Matatiele local municipality in the Eastern Cape and certain areas of Bagamutiba in Northwest. The intended redetermination of the provincial boundaries emanates from the communities of the areas in question who wish to be relocated to the neighboring provinces. Coming to messages, Cabinet congratulates France as the preferred host for the 2023 Rugby World Cup and thanks government's delegation headed by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, Sports and Recreation Minister Thula Nxesi, and the South African Rugby Union for the work done in promoting South Africa's bid to host the event. We're saying next time we'll try again. Cabinet congratulates again Minister Pandor, who was awarded the Outstanding Educator Award. The award was presented to Minister Pandor by the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, former President Thabo Mbeki. The Outstanding Educator Award, one of the 4 categories, acknowledges the contribution of any outstanding educator who has excelled in or advanced teaching, learning, skills development, or research in their areas of expertise. Cabinet commends the work done by the South African Astronomical Observatory, which is part of the wide-angle Search for Planets Consortium of planets hunters who have detected 3 new planets. Cabinet congratulates the participants and winners of the 2017 Government Mbeki Awards, which honor those in the construction sector who have excelled in the delivery of houses. The awards come as the country continues to celebrate the delivery of over 4.6 million houses and subsidies since 1994. Finally, Cabinet extends its gratitude to the brave actions by emergency services, firefighters, and all volunteers who assisted in dealing with the recent fires in the Western Cape. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Can we start with Pretoria for questions? David?
There are no questions in Pretoria, DG.
Okay, thanks. Cape Town? I think that was the first one. The Lucas will be you. Yes, it's you.
Thank you very much. Kolegani from Business Day. Minister, just wanted to get an indication of if Minister of Transport, John Masongane, mentioned at all concerns that regarding Sanral and Prasa, which he communicated to the Portfolio Committee on Transport last week, that it was foremost on his mind and that he would address Cabinet about the matter, and especially given the reports of potential write-offs of e-tolling debts, which Sandra was prompt to try and clarify as being a matter of conflation between debt write-off and debt impairment, and all of these matters related to Sandra as a going concern. Just wanted to find out if he mentioned any of that at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Linda?
Yes, good morning, Linda in Business Day. I don't know whether the Cabinet discussed at all the reported proposal for free higher education, university education. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Lula Mamaja, SABC. Minister, I'm just wondering if the Cabinet did get a briefing from State Security Minister on whether on the President Keeper's book, if it is off the shelf, as per the letter from the Minister.
Yes.
Minister Wendell from Reuters. Just wanted to check the delegation to Zimbabwe. Did they land and are they effectively in the country? Because there's been some sort of suggestion that they were turned back.
Okay, that's all, Minister.
Thank you very much. Let me start with Kulegani. No, Minister Masongane has not yet submitted the Cabinet memo. The process is that he would have to submit through the Cabinet committees, which are sitting next week, and then Cabinet. So with yesterday's Cabinet, we didn't have the matter on the agenda. Linda, on the reported free education, as we said that there's a team that is given the responsibility to work in terms of finding implementable solution. They have not tabled the report, hence we welcome the release for society to engage so that by the time Cabinet says this is the direction we're taking, and South Africans would be able to apply their mind and see that this is happening. So it's something that we're still waiting. We'll deal with it later once they are done with their work. Lula Mano, State Security Minister, didn't brief Cabinet in terms of his intention and his work on the book. In terms of the delegation, yes, the delegation is in Zimbabwe doing the work. They have arrived in Zimbabwe. That's the information we have. Thank you very much.
Thanks. One last round. Pretoria, you still don't have any questions?
Yes, no further questions.
Okay, thank you. The last one here, nothing. Minister, we've come to the end of the briefing. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, colleagues.
Well, that is the Cabinet briefing, really. We've lost some of it there, but of course you heard some of the pertinent issues that came out of Cabinet, congratulating France and looking at the situation in Zimbabwe. But we'll give you an update on that a little bit later. Meanwhile, let's go back to court now, where the legal battle is looming with Madikizela Mandela and Nelson Mandela's executors.
That would be contrary to such evidence as there is that he did not follow polygamy.
Yeah. We would submit that the evidence is, and the legal position is, that the customary marriage subsisted.
But that's why I'm saying it seems to be a technicality rather than something that was real in the minds of either Mr. Mandela or your client at the time.
Well, our submission is that it was very real in the mind of Mrs. Mandela. We can't speculate on what was in the mind of Mr. Mandela. But and I think it's important, and it's an issue that falls very close to my client's heart. I think we must emphasize that for my client, the customary practices, the customary traditions are real. They're part of our existence.
But you also say President Mandela also shared that same view. In other words, that he was steeped in tradition, and that your submission earlier was that he was well aware of this customary claim. That he was well aware of your client's customary law claim to the matrimonial home.
We don't have evidence that he was well aware of our client's claim.
Exactly.
I think that's not the submission. The submission is that we must all accept that Mr. Mandela was steeped in his traditions.
Yes. So he would have been aware of such a claim.
We would submit that he ought to have been.
Yes, but that means that when in his will he left the home to his third wife, Miss Marshall, it means he either believed that your client no longer asserted such a claim, or he knew it, and despite that, left the property to somebody else.
Justice Swain, with respect, in the will, the property is not left to Mrs. Marshall.
Yes, no. Well,
the property is left to the trust.
Yes, yes.
For the use of the Mandela family.
Yes.
And then extended, the Mandela family includes, I suppose, my client and the first wife.
Yes, but by leaving it to Miss Marshall, he denied that right, however you phrase it.
No, we submit not.
They're
included, but certainly my client is not excluded. Yes.
Well, you may proceed on your next point. I think we have exhausted.
I'm just trying to find. I just need to come back to the nature of the allotment under customary law, because I think this is an important point, and it's clearly a point which the court below failed to grapple with. And the correct approach to deciding these kind of issues. And the MM decision is absolutely crucial, because it's a clear indication from the Constitutional Court as to how a court should approach any issues relating to customary law. And we cannot emphasize enough that it's important not to view these customary law arrangements, these customary law rules, these customary law traditions, not to view it through the prism of the civil law. I think that's where the court below fell short. And these arrangements, these traditions, these usages are worthy of recognition in their own right. And again, this is what people do. This is how people live. And our Constitution enjoins the courts to not only recognize that, but to celebrate that.
And
not to subjugate.
How's that factored into the, as I understand it, you addressing us on whether the delay was unreasonable and whether it should be condoned. So how does the status of the customary law factor into that inquiry?
We reached this point, Justice Wayne, because I was being questioned about Mrs. Mandela's access to the house. And our submission was that as long as she was allowed open access to the house, that fitted into the customary law scheme. That she was entitled to go there whenever she wished. She was entitled to use the home how she wished.
To explain why she didn't question anything and the reason why she kept going there in the belief that her rights were being recognised.
That's correct, yes.
If that is so, why would the transfer of the property to Mr. Mandela have been inconsistent with your client's rights?
Because the transfer to Mr. Mandela changes the land usage from a customary arrangement into a civil arrangement.
Why? Land is always owned by somebody, whether it's owned by the state or by Mr. Mandela, provided your client's customary rights of use are recognised. Why does it matter who owns the land?
We would submit, Justice Rogers, that the clause in the will that says that the land is for the use of the Mandela family and Mrs. Michelle and her 2 children is irrelevant to the question whether the disposal was lawful or not.
Does your client accept that Ms. Michelle and her children also are entitled to use the property?
No, she doesn't.
Sorry?
She doesn't.
She doesn't?
Yes.
She accepted it for as long as Mr. Mandela was alive, but she doesn't accept it now?
She doesn't accept that it was valid for Mr. Mandela to have dealt with the property in the manner that he did in the will.
So, no, that wasn't my question. My question was, assuming now the property is transferred or currently is owned by the trust that Mr. Mandela nominated in his will,
yes.
But your client is not being denied what she would assert as her customary right to visit and use the place. Does she say that Ms. Michelle is not entitled to use it?
Well, she says that in terms of the law, Mrs. Michelle should not be entitled because the decision to dispose was unlawful. And that there is no reason for my client to be tolerated on the land by virtue of the provision of Mr. Mandela's will, when in fact she's got a right to the land. And that's the crucial difference. Under the allotment, she has a customary law right to the land. She doesn't, and she shouldn't require Mr. Mandela to bequeath her access to the land through a trust created in his will, because she had a right. And that's the issue. That's the effect of the disposal.
Are you saying that she asserts that her customary right is a right which entitles her to exclude people other than the people of her house?
Well,
she may allow them on, but she may not, and that's her choice.
That's correct. The customary law right is an allotment under customary law of her house as the second house.
And are we then to make of how she behaved during Mr. Mandela's lifetime, that although she would have had the right to exclude Ms. Michelle, she chose not to?
That she chose not to, yes.
And did I understand your submission that you just made that Ms. Mandela has the right of access to the house as a beneficiary of a trust in terms of the will?
I'm saying that under the current dispensation, the law as it stands now, the only reason Mrs. Mandela has access to the house is because Mr. Mandela was generous enough to include a clause in his will, which gives her that right, and that the access.
Yes.
And we would submit that she shouldn't require a benevolence from Mr. Mandela,
so in other words,
because she actually had a customary law right that she was disposed of.
So in other words, the late Mr. Mandela was aware and he wanted her to have access to that property, and he made specific provision for it in the will.
Justice Wade, we can't speculate on Mr. Mandela's
frame of mind. What I'm saying is that I just want to understand that, so that was a provision in the will that she have access. We don't need to speculate about what his intention was, but if he left that to her, it's obviously something he wanted.
He left it to the Mandela family, for the use of the Mandela family.
Yes.
Yes. And we assume the Mandela family is not defined, but we assume that that includes my client through an act of benevolence by Mr. Mandela.
Yes.
So does it mean that the disposal of the property did not infringe upon her occupation and of the property?
Justice Mholwa, the submission is that the disposal stripped my client of a customary law right.
Of?
The customary law right under IPILRA of use, of occupation, of enjoyment of the property. With that, she got it subsequently through the benevolence of Mr. Mandela is irrelevant, because that was the statutory right that she had in the first place. And so the question before this court is the manner in which the disposal was done, the manner in which she was stripped of her rights, whether that was lawful.
And what prejudice does she suffer as a result of, as you say, being stripped of that customary law right? What prejudice does she suffer?
She suffers significant prejudice, Justice Swain, because she's been stripped of her rights.
Yes, but
and similarly, the community suffers considerable prejudice because they too have been stripped of their informal rights.
And what is the practical effect of stripping her of that customary law right?
Well, the practical effect, which would have been different to a situation had her rights been respected as they ought to have,
yes,
is that now Mrs. Michelle and her children have access to the property when they previously technically ought not to have.
But she also has access to the property.
That's correct.
So the question is now, what is the practical prejudice that she suffered, because she still has?
Well, for my client, Justice Swain, I apologize, Justice Shongwe, for my client, being stripped of her customary law right has significant prejudice. And there is absolutely no basis why she should have been stripped in the manner that she was. And that is the crucial thing before this court.
Yes, but what it seems is that your client, when you say stripped of her rights, I understand that, but the practical effect is she has access to the property as and when she likes. But her concern is that she wishes to exclude the concomitant rights in terms of the will of Ms. Michelle and her descendants to also use the property.
Because obviously, Justice Swain, under
do I understand that correctly?
You understand it correctly with respect. The practical difference between the two scenarios is the following. The second house would devolve to Mrs. Mandela and her heirs till time immemorial. That has now been distorted by the provisions of the will. So now you have a different set of beneficiaries. And so it does have practical effect. The decision to dispose of the land, the decision to bequeath the land through the will does have a fundamental practical effect that's different from what ought to have been there had Mrs. Mandela's rights been protected.
So at customary law, her descendants would acquire the same right that
That's
she had
correct.
of access?
In perpetuity, yes.
Now, are any of those descendants, aren't they also provided for in terms of their rights of access, in terms of the trusts that are set up?
Except that they, of course, they now share the property with other people.
Yes, no, I understand that. But I mean, as far as her descendants' rights being impinged upon by the denial of her customary law claim, those rights to access are still preserved in terms of their rights as beneficiaries of certain trusts that have been established.
To the extent that they fall within the definition of Mandela family.
Yes.
And I've made the submission to the court that the will doesn't define who's the Mandela family. So it's an open question.
Yes.
And I suppose it's left to the benevolence and discretion of the executors as to who they recognize as the Mandela family. And again, that's a distinct difference.
Ms. Pillay, it may be an open question also whether your client's descendants, under the circumstances that now prevail, will be able to assert any customary rights to the property, because they are beneficiaries under Mr. Mandela's will. And I assume, since the amounts are quite substantial, that they have accepted the benefits of those clauses which leave legacies to them. Yes. And if that's the case, they can't pick and choose in the will. The law is reasonably clear that they will then have to accept the disposition which Mr. Mandela made of the property.
Yeah, Justice Rogers, I think it's important for us to emphasize that we're not here before you today challenging the will. I think
no, I was just commenting on your proposition that, as it were, this will be tribal rights for Ms. Mandela's, your client's household in perpetuity.
Yes.
And that may not be correct, because I think the children and grandchildren, having accepted benefits under Mr. Mandela's will not be able to stand in the way of the way he dealt with Kunu.
Yes, but with respect, I was being asked to address the prejudice to Mrs. Mandela.
Yes.
And that's the context within which the submission is made.
It's mainly, I think we should focus on her personal prejudice.
But yes, for her, the fact that she's been robbed of this customary legacy is a real prejudice for her.
I understand that submission. Can I just ask you, what state of mind do you ask us, if any, to attribute to the late Mr. Mandela when he accepted the disposition of this land and the transfer of this land into his name and then disposed of it as he did in his will? do you ask us to find that being aware of your client's right to the property under customary law, he was party to stripping her of those rights?
Justice Rogers, we don't ask the court to make any findings on Mr. Mandela's state of mind.
But we may, in assessing the question of unreasonable delay and so forth, we may need to form a view on that, because one view is Mr. Mandela just was completely unaware at all times that this was your client's property under customary law. Now that may be quite significant. It seems to me that the only way in which you can avoid a conclusion that he knowingly deprived your client of her rights in conflict with tribal law is to say that, well, he just wasn't aware of the allocation of the property to her. Now which of those is it?
We've, Justice Rogers, carefully avoided speculating on Mr. Mandela's state of mind. The crucial issue before this court is not whether Mr. Mandela wanted to strip Mrs. Mandela of her rights under customary law. The crucial issue before this court is the lawfulness of the decision to dispose. And to inquire into the lawfulness of the decision to dispose, this court is bound to look at the record of the decision before the decision maker. The decision maker is the minister.
But is it, am I right, it isn't consistent with your client's version and of what she says she spoke to Mr. Mandela about and how things were arranged? It's not consistent with that version that Mr. Mandela was acting in good faith when he took transfer of the property and disposed of it as he did in his will. Your client would have to say he was acting contrary to what he knew the true position was.
Well, my client's position, Justice Rogers, is that she did not consent to the disposal and that it was well known that she had customary law rights.
Including to Mr. Mandela?
It must have been known to Mr. Mandela because he was part of that arrangement.
But we would have to find on your submission that because President Mandela was steeped in customary law and tradition, he ought to have known that that house belonged to Mrs. Mandela. And when she made a disposition in the will, she stripped Ms. Mandela of her customary law rights.
We understand.
Is that the invitation that you're asking us to go to?
Justice Matopa, we understand that Mr. Mandela included Kudu in his will as a result of the decision to dispose. So he was aware that a disposal had been made in his favor. And for that reason, of course, it was included in the will.
Let's take it a step back.
Yes.
If there was no disposition, obviously you wouldn't make that.
That's correct.
In the will.
Yes. So just to round the submission off, our submission is that the frame of mind of Mr. Mandela is, we submit, irrelevant. What is relevant before you is, before the court, is the legality of the decision, and that should be the focus. Whether it's President Mandela or President Zuma or President Mbeki, ultimately, that is the other personality involved. Shouldn't color the facts.
The way it potentially features into what you're still addressing, the conduct of a reasonable person, is that we have certain outward manifestations of conduct which suggest that known to your client, which Mr. Mandela appears not to be recognizing her rights, particularly by extending the property without reference to her, spending a lot of money on it without reference to her, and taking Miss Michelle there without reference to her. And then we have further evidence from the fact that he took transfer of the property into his name and saw it as his right to dispose of it in his will, that those outward manifestations are consistent with what we know subjectively of Mr. Mandela's belief, which was that he never viewed your client as having a right to the property. So we have a combination of Mr. Mandela subjectively regarding the property as his and not your client's, and then outwardly dealing with it in that way.
Well, at the time that Mr. Mandela dealt with the property, it in fact was his. So it wasn't only his subjective belief, the property was his. There had been a disposal. But our submission is, what is before the court is not whether Mr. Mandela believed he was entitled to dispose of to deal with the property in the manner that he did. This court cannot lose sight of the legality of the decision to dispose. And I can quote so many recent Constitutional Court decisions on the importance of preserving good, clean governance, on the importance of ensuring that our decisions are taken in lawful and constitutional, in a lawful and constitutional manner. And our submission to this court would be the personalities of the people involved are irrelevant. It cannot be that there's a certain standard for certain people in our country and a different standard for others. The standard must be the same.
No, clearly that is so.
I don't think that's been suggested at all, that there's a different standard that applies in this case. But what you are seeking with this review is to set aside a decision that you say was unlawfully taken by the Minister.
That's
and
correct,
what you're
Justice.
dealing with is, was the delay unreasonable, and should that delay be condoned?
We're still at the preliminary stage of dealing with unreasonableness, and I understood the questions to be posed in the context of what was in Mrs. Mandela's mind at the time. Her submission is that whether or not Mr. Mandela believed he was entitled to dispose or that he was willfully stripping Mrs. Mandela of her rights is irrelevant ultimately.
So on the issue of taking due care, what is your submission in regard to your client's conduct? In other words, if you subject your conduct to look through the prism of the reasonable person in her position,
yes.
Do you say that there was no earlier stage at which a reasonable person would have made inquiries and questioned what was being done on the property, and that would inevitably have led to information that, well, this is my property, the Minister gave it to me?
Justice Swain, we make the following submissions on the question of reasonable care. Firstly, that the two factors that the court took into account were, both of them flawed, that they were not borne out by the evidence, and so we submit that that's sufficient basis to set aside that decision. But the facts which we rely on to submit to this court that in fact there was no outward manifestation which ought to have raised a red flag for Mrs. Mandela is the fact that firstly she had unimpeded access to the house, that secondly there is not one member of the community, there is no evidence of one member of the community who was aware of the disposal. So this disposal occurred entirely invisibly to the community itself. And we submit that is a crucial feature. If there was any evidence from any community member that they knew that the land was disposed and into the personal name of Mr. Mandela, that would be a relevant fact, but that just doesn't exist. And I would invite my learned friend for the Minister to point out where in fact that evidence exists.
But didn't Chief Dehaha wrote a letter to the magistrate?
Justice Matopo, we would submit that that letter doesn't form part of the record of decision. So it is not something which this court should take into account when assessing the lawfulness of the decision. But in any event, the letter doesn't deal with the decision to dispose of the land into the name of Mr. Mandela.
Yeah, but what does it deal with?
Let me refer the court to the letter. I believe it's in volume 2. Yeah.
There seems to be a suggestion, why are you looking at it?
Yes.
There seems to be a suggestion that Mtehaha wrote to the magistrate to suggest that that piece of land be allocated to the late president.
Yes. And we would submit what you're dealing with there is an allocation. It's an allotment exactly like how Mrs. Mandela's allotment was. It's not, a disposal is a different legal animal to an allotment or to an allocation. And so what we're inviting the minister to do, or even the executives, because they seem to be running in the forefront of this battle, we're inviting them to put evidence before you that there was one community member who knew about the disposal, not the allotment.
But before there's a disposal, there has to be an allotment.
We accept that there was an allotment.
But isn't Chief Mtehaha talking about the allotment, which is a necessary step to a disposal?
We would submit, Justice Matopo, that the allotment is radically different from a disposal. And we don't dispute that there was an allotment of the property, an allocation of the property to Mr. and Mrs. Mandela. We don't dispute that. We have never tried to enforce an exclusive right on behalf of Mrs. Mandela. What we do dispute is that the community was consulted in order to dispose of the land into Mr. Mandela's personal name. And that's the issue on which we would invite them to place evidence before you, because it just doesn't exist. Not one community member was aware of the decision to dispose.
But let's look at that ballot. I think it's G3. Is that the letter from Mr. Mtirara?
That's correct. Yes, it's G3.
What page is that?
It's on page 354 of volume 2.
This letter on G3, I want to take you a bit back, where the allotment of this property was actually made, according to Mrs. Mandela, to her.
Yes.
Then, on G3, it's now the extension.
That's correct.
Of that property, but her name is not there. It's only the name of Mr. Mandela.
Yes, we would accept that. That the initial allotment was to Mrs. Mandela, and that's what she relies on.
Yes, and it was her property as the second one.
As the second house, that's correct. And that was subsequently extended through this process.
Mm-hmm.
So the allotment was increased, there was an extension. But that doesn't detract from the initial allotment, which is what Mrs. Mandela is relying on.
And your client was in no way involved in the extension of the site from 9 hectares to 100 hectares?
She wasn't involved in the extension of the site, no.
Yes.
But she was a right holder.
That extension on the evidence before us happened by way of a ceremony involving Mr. Mandela and the local community.
Well, it seems that there is a...
Didn't they walk around the extended boundaries and so forth? And there was talk about the fact that on one side there would need to be a discussion with the person who had the neighbouring allotment.
Yeah. Justice Rogers, we don't dispute that there was an extension of the allotment at the request of Mr. Mandela, if that's the question. I think we just want to be clear that we don't accept any of the facts set out in the hearsay allegations.
But it was an extension of allotment which happened without regard to your client, and at a stage when your client and Mr. Mandela had not been speaking for some years.
Well, we would submit Justice Rogers
we just need to go back because we're still talking about reasonableness.
Yes.
The way your client says we must interpret this is that she and Mr. Mandela would both have understood that he was extending her land. Now this is in 1995, or as I think actually in 1996. I think the parties have got the dates wrong, but not much turns on that. At a time when they'd been separated for 3 years and not talking, here he was very generously adding another 90 hectares to her allotment. You're saying that that's how she understood it?
Well, I'm saying that those are the facts, that they were married both under customary law and under civil law at the time.
You say personalities are not important, but when it comes to, that is certainly true when it comes to legality. But when it comes to reasonableness, we have to look at how these people would have behaved and what would have been reasonable in their position. Now, could your client ever have believed in 1995 or 1996 that Mr. Mandela would be wanting to extend her allotment by 90 hectares so that he could carry out farming operations on the allotment of the second wife, to whom he had been estranged and quite bitterly estranged for some years?
Well, my client, Justice Rogers, not only believed that, but that's what she says in the affidavits, that he was her husband. He was extending the property.
Well, she says in her founding affidavit, paragraph 36, at page 24, have you got that?
I've got it.
As I indicated before, the site is now big because further extensions were made when we asked the authorities to extend the site.
That's right.
For purpose of also conducting farming, since my husband liked livestock, and that is denied by the executors at page 336, paragraph 114. The allegations herein are denied. The reasons for the extension of the size of the property do not implicate the applicant. Will you recall that the extension documents do not make any mention of the applicant but mention Mr. Mandela? In addition, Mr. Mandela had announced his separation from the applicant on the 13th of April 1992 at a press conference The extensions to the size of the property were only done in 1995, 3 years after Mr. Mandela had been separated from the applicant.
That's Advocate Bezos's view of the relationship. What Mrs. Mandela is saying here is that these extensions happened at the time that they were married.
But she says she was part of the request.
The initial request she was part of, yes. So when the extensions were done, they were done by her husband. It's as simple as that.
And then on the application of Pascal Evans?
Well, we submit that the facts which are put up by the executives are not sufficient to dislodge the version put forward by Mrs. Mandela. And the objective facts support that at the time that they were legally married in terms of civil law, they were legally married in terms of customary law. And therefore, there is no reason to suggest that Mr. Mandela was making these extensions and these improvements to the exclusion of Mrs. Mandela.
And what weight do you attach to the absence of your client's name on the extension documents?
None whatsoever, Justice. In customary law, it didn't really matter.
He was doing it as the head of the household.
As the head of the household, that's correct.
Now, I still find an air of unreality. They were still married. They'd been separated since April 1992 and had not spoken. They were divorced in March 1996, and the case number indicates that the divorce summons, we know this was a fully blown opposed case, but eventually went through without opposition, it seems, or without your client putting up an affirmative case. But the summons was issued in 1995. So all of this was happening probably at a time when they were completely estranged and when divorce proceedings were pending. And your client wants us to believe, but they were married. All of this was being done to extend the property of her household as the second wife, so to the building of houses.
Justice Rogers, I think if the personalities are going to become relevant, then we must accept that there was an air of unreality that permeated the entire relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Mandela.
Shouldn't we look at the lived realities of the parties, removing the personalities?
That's what we submit, Justice Matopo. And we say it's relevant that the marriage was the type of marriage that it was in the bigger scheme.
No.
So we submit that it was entirely in line with our client's position at the time, that Mr. Mandela was making, through benefactors, was making extensions to the home, and she accepted it. And they were married, and why shouldn't she? They were married at the time.
Do you want to move to the point of prejudice?
Justice Shongwe, I see that it's a few minutes to 11 o'clock. May I ask the court's indulgence that we take a short break now? I just need to get something to drink.
Very well. Court will take 15 minutes adjournment.
The legal battle over Madiba's home in Kunu continues. Now, we'll go back there live in 15 minutes' time when they come back. But right now, we'll take a short break and we come back at the top of the hour with your news headlines.
The new 1 litre from Carling Black Label. Share the ultimate reward. Do you have a funeral policy?
Making someone's dreams come true is not always as simple as saying yes, But AVBOB's cashback funeral plan not only provides funeral insurance for your family, but also helps you to say yes to life's little extras. Because for every 5 claim-free years, you'll get an entire year's premiums based on your monthly premium value, paid back in cash. SMS Duduza to 41790 and we'll call you. AVBOB, we're here for you.
If you want AVBOB to contact you, SMS Duduza and your name to 41790.
A lot of us rely on tech to survive, and Africa is already a mobile-first continent.
We build mobile technology that connects motorcycle taxis to commuters and businesses in real time.
My phone was the most important thing.
Africans are using technology to innovate. On Network, we have African technology and social media news. Even robots have heard about us.
Hello, watch Network on SABC.
For African technology and social media news, join Ms. Phumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 9 p.m.
$1,100 hours here on the Newsroom, Jumbo Africa, and welcome to the final hour. I'm Elvis Preston. I'll be with you until 12 o'clock. Now today we focus on Zimbabwe. The SABC has reliably learned that Zimbabwe is likely to have a transitional government following yesterday's army takeover. And that's why we're asking you this question on your screen right now. What do you think led to President Robert Mugabe's downfall? I'd like to get your thoughts on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom as well as on the Facebook page. But we're also coming back home in relation to our poll because we're focusing here in South Africa. It's a major problem that we do have with copper theft. The scourge is escalating. It costs us about 5 billion rand a year, and we're asking you, should cable theft be declared an economic crime? So far, 347 votes in, 93% of you are saying yes, it should be declared an economic crime, 7% suggesting no. We'll read your comments a little bit later, but right now, as we speak, in Parktown, the Life Isidameni arbitration process is underway. Let's go there live.
Because they don't know what scratched him. Because it was turning into sauce.
Yeah.
And that was in June 2016.
In the illegal June 2016,
yeah.
Yes.
For 1 month.
I kept him for 1 month for him to heal. When I took him back to the school, when the lady informed me that Koto fell and he's in hospital, she asked me, was I not informed?
Sorry, when is this now?
This year.
It was during this year.
Before.
Oh, okay. But sorry, we'll get to that. But so you returned, Khotsu, you took him back to Siabadinga or CCR. When did you take him back?
At CCRC. Where he got injuries, that is where I took him back.
Yeah.
So we know Khotsu passed away on the 3rd of August 2016. Is that correct, ma'am?
Khotsu otlokofetse ka di 3 tsa August 2016, ma'am Mpofu. Yes.
When prior to that, when was it the last time that you saw him?
La bofelo home mona pele a ka tlhokofala. I visited him after he fell. He had a bruised arm. I nursed him. He was healed. He recovered.
Yes.
And he was coughing something brownish as if it was blood. His cough was brownish.
Yes.
Now, lastly, when he passed on, he fell down. His lips were bruised. I was not informed.
Yes. Let me take you to that, ma'am. Let me take you to that. On page 4 of ELA 64, page 4. These documents we received the day before yesterday.
I see page 4 ke pampiri tse re tlileng gone yaanong.
We heard the evidence of, are you there, ma'am?
O na le rona mo yaanong ma.
Yeah.
Re na le bopaki bo bo tswang ko sister.
We heard the evidence of Sister Manaka that this is a transfer document, application for transfer, and that is the document that's completed by CCRC and it's taken with the patient to the hospital.
Ba re form e ke tladitsweng ke mema Manaka a fileng bopaki bo mabane gore form e tladitswe ke e tla tswatswa molwetse he a transferiwa.
So we note on the 20th of July 2016,
Right, ka di 20 July 2016.
almost little bit less than 2 weeks before Khotsu passed on.
E ka nna beke tse
Passed
pedi
away.
pele Khotso a ka tlhokofala.
He fell so hard that they needed to take him to the hospital.
O wele botlhoko mo e leng gore se la fetsa a isitswe ko sepetlele.
Did they phone you, ma'am?
Se le ba founela me No, they didn't call me.
They didn't tell you anything.
Ha ba go bolelela sepe. No.
But you visited just before this, just before the 20th of July.
Yeah.
2016 was your last visit.
Pele ha di 20 tsa July. He na tlile ko lapeng. O mo etele. Yes.
Ha tlhokofala ba founetse malome wa gagwe ebile e se bone.
After he passed on, his uncle was called, and it was not them, it was my neighbor.
From Kimberley.
From Kimberley. The uncle called us from Kimberley and reported to us that he had heard that Khoso passed on.
So they didn't phone you. They knew you because you visited CCRC.
O ba ho itse hore tlhola o eta ko CCRC mara ha ba founele wena. No. And they have our contact details.
Ma'am, how did you heard that Khotsu passed on?
Wena o tlile yang hore Khotso tlhokofetse?
Ko malomeng wa Khotso o se o mo founetse a le ko gae a le ko Kimberley.
From Khotso's uncle who resides in Kimberley, the lady called him in Kimberley.
Because ga ana di phone tsa rona.
Because she said he does not have our phones.
Yeah.
And did you phone CCRC or the staff there?
Wena se le wa founela CCRC kgotsa babereki ba ko teng?
Ra ya ko kaofela ko teng.
We all went there.
Yes, and what did they tell you? Did they tell you something?
Ba re fela Khotso o ile ene o tlhokofetse ko sepetlele.
We were informed that Khotso fell down and he died at the hospital.
Was that the reasons they gave you?
Ke le baka le ba go netseng ka lona.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you ask them, why didn't you phone us?
O ba botsisitse me mambo gore gore le sa re founela.
Ba re ga bana di phone ba na le maka because na ke ba.
They said they don't have our contact details, but they were lying because I finished them with my contact details.
Ma'am, how did you do you then have to go and get Khotsu's body from the hospital?
Lile yang go ilo tsa setupo sa ga Khotso ko sepetlele.
Pele go ile na le bana ba ka ra go tsa setupo.
It was myself and my children who went to fetch his body.
Ra go ba pila tota re bo fitlhe.
And placed him at a safe place up until we buried him.
Did somebody there speak to you and tell you what happened to him?
No.
No.
Just Uwile.
Where did you take his corpse to? We took him to the hospital. We took him from the hospital, from the institution.
Yeah.
We took him to our mortuary in Kalinin. Where did he pass on? At Dag Hospital, Mamelodi Dag Hospital, Mamelodi Day Hospital. When they took him to hospital, were you informed? No. But you took his body from the hospital? Yes.
So They only phoned you after Khotsu passed on.
Le founetswe fela se ne Khotso a hlokofala.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did they phone you on the same day?
Ba le founetse ka lona tsatsi leo. Yes.
But late.
But late.
But late. So, now, ma'am, yesterday you were present here when we heard the evidence of Mrs. Monaka, who testified.
Only temo bani mema mpofu he mema manaka sister manaka afana ka bopaki.
Yeah, can I get it?
Yes, I was present.
She testified with respect to the medical records and the documents, and unfortunately all that we have showed that on the 20th of July he had fallen to such an extent that he needed to be taken to hospital. And that on the 3rd of August 2016 he started to vomit a brownish fluid, and that it was then decided to take him to the Mamelodi hospital.
Yes, they did not inform us. I only heard later.
But you said, ma'am, that you actually you saw when you visited there 2 weeks prior to that, you saw that his condition was deteriorating.
Too much. He was very tiny.
But did they tell you what was wrong with him?
They say they don't know, but all right.
They say they don't know, but he'll come all right. He'll be fine.
Did they tell you that he had been starving?
That's
what Sister Manaka told us.
Yeah, because now always I care. And they get at lunchtime.
Yes, mostly I like to visit him during lunchtime. And I'll find him being fed with small portion of food. And it was rice, and she loved food.
Yeah, no.
Did you see him deteriorating? Yes.
Not picking and tata.
Not a little, but a very serious. And I thought of taking him away. Because I thought, how am I going to take care of him? Because I don't have that strength. Even Mrs. Manaka testified yesterday. She told us that she was not being given fluid, like water and juice, etc. And as he had epilepsy, and that they were giving him medication, tablets, and at this place they did not give him medication.
So he had epilepsy, and your knowledge is that he was not being given epilepsy tablets.
Because yes, always
May you God interpret what I've asked in Setswana also.
Sorry, you know it's a that is what I thought. No, I asked if they were giving him epilepsy tablets. Yes, they give him there, but not at the new place.
So you used to get the tablets at CCRC?
CCRC. Yes. But at there they didn't give him.
Did they ever tell you why?
They mostly reported to me that he got tablets once in the morning.
Yeah.
But did they ever tell you why, after 5 years at CCRC, he had to be moved to Siabadinga.
Ba go file ma ba go tlhaloseditse gore goreng a nana le 5 years ko CCRC banong ba mo tlosa ba mo sutisa ba mo ise go Siabadinga. They said it's a place for babies.
That's why Baba Khulu ba
That is why they were moving out the adults.
And now you know that that is not true.
Yes.
Who told you that they're making space for babies?
Ke mang o ne a go bolela gore ba bankanyetsa bana ba bannyane? It was the staff there.
And now you know that adults, many adults from Esidimeni replaced your son, your grandson.
Why do what happens? Ba emetseng ngwana mo setlogolo sa gago mosimanyana gago. Ba replaced mosimana gago. Who?
People, patients, mental health care users who were transferred from Esidimeni, somewhere from Waverley in Randfontein, were brought to Esidimeni. I'm sorry, brought to Kalinen. And your grandson was moved to make way for them.
And when I do you know that? No.
Did you hear that here in the proceedings? No.
Let's break away from the Life Esidimeni arbitration process for a while, because AfriForum and private prosecutor Gerrie Nel say they will be announcing a private prosecution of a very prominent person in President Jacob Zuma's inner circle. Now, last month they announced that they would be prosecuting President Jacob Zuma's son, Duduzane Zuma, for culpable homicide in the death of Phumzile Dube. Let's go there live.
Under law, as I understand it, to review and set aside that decision of Abrams. I understand it's still before the courts. Will that in any way impede the application for the certificate of no prosecution, or how do you plan to address that?
No, I think the freedom under law case, as well as what we are doing, both of these cases have the same purpose, and that is that nobody should be above the law, not even if you're a friend of the president, such as Advocate Jiba. If freedom under law is successful with their application, then of course it says it's irrational, then there has to be a new decision taken. And if that is successful and she is prosecuted, it would also be a win for us. But as it stands at the moment, that court case has not come before the courts, and so the decision not to prosecute still stands. And therefore, there's no reason why we can also not take the second avenue. And I think, irrespective, I think both actions can run parallel and both serve the same purpose. Anton.
Good morning, Anton Meyer from Pretoria FM. General, as I understand, there's still, Sean Abrams reinstituted the charges of racketeering against you. Based on the same evidence in front of him that Jiba had when she decided to prosecute you. That case is ongoing, if I'm correct. Would you consider privately going after Sean Abrams should that case also be thrown out of the court?
I would invite the media to actually get hold of my application, the review application against the decision by Sean Abrams to prosecute me, in which I set out clearly the timeline, and I refer to all the interferences that's occurred over the last couple of years. I've also opened cases against two other members of the prosecuting authority thus far. That's Advocate Gladstone Mayema, as well as Advocate Moipoena Norkov in KZN. Those cases are been finalized, and I'm being advised that there are indeed prima facie cases against both those advocates, and should the NPA decline to prosecute them, I'll consider my options. And to answer your question, yes, I will most definitely consider instituting prosecutions against Sean Abrams in the not too distant future.
Any other questions?
Yes. From Times newspaper. In terms of time frame, when are we likely to see this prosecution now proceed? I mean, can you give us an indication? Is this something that's going to go ahead immediately, or is there still certain loopholes that need to be gone through?
Yes. According to the Act, the National Prosecutor of National NDPP and the people working there has should have a fair chance to take a decision, but our view is that 2 to 3 months is more than adequate to do so. But of course, when you have a captured institution, we know that they would be reluctant to give us the Nolly Prosecute certificate. So we are ready to go ahead with Mandamu's application to force them to take a decision if after 2 or 3 months we have no response from them. There are two things that they can do. They can reconsider and decide then to go ahead with the prosecution of Advocate Jiba themselves, or they can give us the certificate. Irrespective, for us, we only want to see prosecution to make sure that there's equality before the law, and in both instances we would see it as a win. Yes.
Another time from PCA. How much of an influence did the recent book by Jacques play in this decision?
As I've mentioned, in terms of my mind, the decision that we needed to prosecute Advocate Jiba was already something that we thought of in August 2015, when Advocate Abrams made his announcement. But of course, we then had to go through a process to set up our private prosecutions unit. So it did not play a role. But I think what is important is that Jacques Pauw's book underlined the problem that we have, that there are people in prominent positions that are captured and serve as keepers of the president. And we need, as a civil society, make inroads into that. So in the end, we must just continue on this course, and in the end, I believe the House of Cards will tumble if we continue on this course. You know, many people ask us, why don't you prosecute this person or that person or the president? The problem is, of course, that the wheels of justice turn slowly. We cannot simply just decide we're going to prosecute somebody. There needs to be a process where there's an investigation, a process where there's a decision not to prosecute, and only then we can do that. So even though the wheels of justice turn slowly, one of the goals of our private prosecution unit is to make sure that the wheels continue to turn. And the wheel will turn for other people involved in state capture. And we are starting from one point. I think this is a big inroad we're making with this case, but there will most definitely be other cases that follow as soon as the legal process allows us to intervene.
Perhaps I could just add to Mr. Creel's response there. Advocate Gary Kruger, Gary Nel and myself have been in consultation for quite some time, and as you're aware, to prosecute you need a docket. So we had to compile the docket, and I think those of you who know Gary Nel is quite meticulous, and it was quite a comprehensive task to compile this docket. So that we've been busy for months compiling the docket, and only when he was satisfied that we did indeed have a complete docket to proceed with the matter, that we decided to embark on the issue that we're here for you today.
Yes, and if I can also add to that, and according to the law, as soon as you get the Nolly Prosecute certificate, you only have 90 days to start your private prosecution. So before we come to a point of announcement like we're doing today, we need to make sure that we are ready to start prosecution if we get the certificate.
Do you foresee any problems getting the certificate?
Well, I foresee problems because we've seen Advocate Abrams was willing to manipulate the process to decide not to prosecute Advocate Jiba or to withdraw the case against her, despite the fact that from his own office he had legal opinions saying that it was a sound case. So if he was willing to do that and protect Advocate Jiba, he would continue to try and protect her, and one of those methods might be not to want to give us this certificate or delay that, but that's why I said we are ready to go to court to force him to do his job.
Lisa Gatana, News 24. You also asked for a non-prosecute certificate for Duzane Zuma. I just want to find out how far has that process gone?
Yes, the same principle applies, that they need to have a fair time to make their considerations. The Act does not prescribe what a fair time is for them, but according to our view, it's about 2 to 3 months. So because the prosecution or the non-prosecution request with regard to the Duzane Zuma was only a month or so ago, we will early in the new year, if we have not received any feedback, we will go ahead and take the action that needs to be taken.
Sid Fosterman from SABC TV News. I just want your response to criticism that we're getting as we're feeling this online, that AfriForum is playing a political game, considering that last month there was an announcement regarding private prosecution of Duzane Zuma, and this month it's another Zuma-related person. So what's your response to that? Is this a political card that you're playing, particularly looking at the president and his keepers, if you want to call it that?
Well, I think if there is politics being played, it's being played by those people that were captured. Remember, we did not decide from our own to prosecute Duzane Zuma or Advocate Jiba. What happened, there were political links into the prosecuting authority that then decided not to prosecute both of them, irrespective of the fact that there were a prima facie case against them. And it's because of that political interference that we have to come in. If the prosecuting authority did their job without fear, favour or prejudice as they should, there would be no need for us to intervene. So yes, it's about politics, but the politics is not on our side, it's on the side of those that protect people because of their political position or because of their political ties. Anton?
Connie, we know Jiba and Harimel, Harry also has a history. Jiba major role in that arrest of Nell in 2008, and
Well, that was the AfriForum press conference as we speak. Of course, they're going to charge Advocate Nonqobo Jiba with treason. In fact, let me just go back here and just have a look. It was perjury, rather, and fraud. That was for charging Johan Boysen with racketeering. So, but let's go back now to Life is Sedimeni, where the arbitration process is still ongoing.
She testified that your grandson died of hunger and lack of fluid and water. Were there no food at that school institution? You are now asking a proper question, but I don't have an answer now. I was just advising you what was her testimony yesterday. But when you arrived at Siabadinga, there were no food. It was just a little of food, a portion of food. It was little and rice. And it was rice. Each of them was served with a small portion of rice. 2 spoons. 2 spoons. As your counselor was asking you, he was not given epilepsy medication. No. We only gave him medication when he was at home, even there, at where he was stationed first.
Now he's taken back to CRC.
So we said it's CRC.
And he continues to be weaker and weaker.
And they didn't inform you? Nothing. Not at all.
Any more questions, Councillor?
No further questions. Thank you, Justice.
Cross-examination.
Thank you for coming to testify for these proceedings, Mrs. Mpofu. I'm sorry for your loss. I have no questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Cross.
Thank you, Justice. We have no questions.
No questions, Justice.
The councillor is going to speak to you.
Greetings to you, Ms. Mpofu.
Madume Mpofu.
We have heard your account of how your grandson, David Mpofu, has passed on.
David Mpofu.
It is indeed sad, and we regret for his passing. And we want to take this opportunity to apologize on behalf of the government for what had happened.
Yes.
And we say this now, and we want to let you know that other government officials will also be coming before these proceedings to extend their apology. And
thank you.
And what we want to say to you is that through this process, we hope that the government, together with those who are affected, are able to find closure and that they should be redressed to those who have been affected. We just want to thank you for having taken the time to come and participate in these proceedings. Finally, we hope that you heal during the process that we are undertaking, and appropriate measures will be taken to assist you through.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mpofu. Justice, there are no questions to the witness.
Thank you. You
have the right to answer this, what is being put to you. Fine?
All right.
Fine? What can I say?
Thank you,
ma'am. You're not forced to say anything. The government was just pleading with you and asking for forgiveness. I have heard and I said thank you. And I'm happy. You are those who wiped off my tears.
Thank you.
Thank you. We thank you, ma'am.
Re-examination, Council.
No re-examination. Thank you, Justice.
Found Cranford, ma'am. Be healed.
Now we're going to take the tea break and we'll resume at 12 midday. We are adjourned.
That's the tea break there, the life Esidimeni arbitration process. Meanwhile, the customary marriage involving former President Nelson Mandela and his ex-wife Winnie became the center of Madikizela Mandela's attorney submissions in the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. Let's go there live.
What IPILRA does is give the court a very clear indication of the nature of the customary law arrangement in respect of the land. Because while IPILRA states in 2.1 that no one can be deprived of his or her informal right to land, it's section 2.2 which we want to draw your attention to. So section 2.2 states that where land is held on a communal basis, a person may, subject to subsection 4, be deprived of such land or right in land in accordance with the custom and usage of the community. Now what we submit 2.2 gives the court a clear indication of is that there are parallel rights between Mrs. Mandela and the community in respect of the land. So in other words, when the community makes an allotment to Mrs. Mandela, they do not divest themselves of all rights to the land. And there is some customary, some community arrangement that remains, and that is regulated by 2.2 and 2.3 of IPILRA. Now we make that submission in the light of the Court of Quo's judgment, and specifically paragraph 33 of the judgment, which is at page 710. I'm sorry, if we can go to paragraph 33, which is at page 710. The court says, we are prepared to accept without deciding that such a formal resolution by the community of Kunu was not obtained in respect of the donation to Mr. Mandela, but it is important to note that this requirement would be relevant only if Mrs. Mandela did not have the right of occupation and use of the property. If she had obtained the right of occupation and use of the property from the community, as she claimed, no rights of the community would be implicated. And we would submit that that finding is just, it's wrong in law. And so where the court makes the finding that the community was not, that the community did not give a formal resolution as required by ULTRA, we submit that that finding has very real consequences. And the consequences would be that the decision must have been unlawful. Because as IPILRA shows you, even if there is an allotment, the community still retains some rights to the land.
But you accept the fact that the Court did not, in fact, decide that issue?
Well, we would submit, Justice Shongwe, that what the court did is it considered this in the broader exercise of its discretion on condonation, and therefore it did feature in the decision. And we would submit it's a clear factor that the decision was not properly exercised and that there was an incorrect appreciation of the law. We've dealt extensively in the papers and in the heads of argument with the question of why we believe there was no evidence before the decision maker of consent by the community, and why the resolution relied upon by the minister is fundamentally flawed. That's dealt with and itemized at page 600, paragraph 45.1 of our replying affidavit, where it's pointed out that the person who signed the resolution was not the head of the Ibotwe, but the deputy head, and that's in his own words, that the resolution was not one of the Ibotwe Tribal Authority, that the Ibotwe took no resolution to dispose, that in any event, and this is a fundamental point which the minister just doesn't deal with at all, that the Ibotwe Tribal Authority did not have the power to grant consent. Now, if the court has regard to IPILRA, you will see that IPILRA defines a tribe. It defines a tribe as including any community living and existing like a tribe, and any part of a tribe living and existing as a separate entity. So when IPILRA conceptualizes of the tribe, they're actually referring to the people living in the area. And so when the minister is challenged to put up a resolution from the tribe, he is actually required to put up a resolution from the community concerned. What the minister does is he puts up a so-called resolution by the Ibotwe Tribal Authority. And when we challenge that resolution on the basis that that's not the appropriate community, the minister is dead silent. And we submit that this is a clear indication that there was no formal resolution as required by IPILRA and by ULTRA, and that therefore the decision was unlawful. And in any event, we point out in our heads of argument and in our affidavits that the shortcomings of the resolution was drawn to the minister's attention by the Director General in no uncertain terms. The DG points out to the minister what the requirements of IPILRA are, what the resolution from the community should look like. And notwithstanding this, just a few days later, the minister makes the disposal, well aware that there wasn't a proper resolution in the record. So we would submit that on the broader merits, there's clear evidence that there was no consent, that consent was required under IPILRA and under ULTRA as the Court of Law found, and that therefore the decision was unlawful. I don't want to belabor the point, Justice Shongwe, but I just want to draw your attention to the portions of our heads of argument where we collect the evidence of the allotment to Mrs. Mandela. You'll be aware that there are multiple affidavits from eyewitnesses who were there on the day when the allotment was made. And it's all gathered together in our heads of argument at paragraph 17 to 21. And specifically at paragraph 22. Now, I would like to add to that reference, because what that does, in that portion of our heads of argument, we collect all of the evidence put forward by Mrs. Mandela of eyewitnesses who were there on the day when the allotment was made. I want to add to that reference Mr. Mbande, who is the 9th respondent, his affidavit, which appears at volume 3, page 414, paragraph 12. And what Mr. Mbande does is, unsolicited by Mrs. Mandela, he tells us in his affidavit that he was present on the day when the site was allotted to Mrs. Mandela. So he's an additional eyewitness who I just want to add to the list. Justice Shongwe, that brings me to the ultra-virus argument, and I don't want to spend too much of time on the ultra-virus argument, but just to lay the bare bones of the argument before the court. The import of the ultra-virus argument is that it is not considered by the court in its decision on leg 1 and leg 2, on unreasonable delay and condonation. And what I wish to do is just to draw the court's attention to the broad picture of the argument. I am running out of time, but if I can ask you to turn up the State Land Disposal Act. I'm not sure if the court has copies. I have copies available, Justice Shongwe.
Yes, you may give us copies if you have.
If I can ask the court to go to page 195 of the bundle which we've just handed out.
Page
195. And you will recall that one of the ultra-virus points raised by the appellant on the papers is that the minister didn't have the power under the State Land Disposal Act to dispose of the land in question. Now, if the court has regard to the definition of state land, as it appears on page 195, you'll see that state land is defined as any land over which the right of disposal by virtue of the provisions of Section 3(4) of the Agricultural Holdings Act and Section 78(3) and 4 of the Town Planning and Townships Ordinance of 1965 vests in the state president and any right in respect of state land.
Just a second.
I'm sorry,
Yes, you may proceed.
Thank you. The definition of state land on page 195 of the authorities bundle. The simple point, Justice Shongwe and members of the court, is that the definition of state land is any land over which the president has the right of disposal. And so wherever the state or the president wants to invoke, or in this case the minister, wants to invoke the right under the State Land Disposal Act, it has to be clear that the land is land over which they have the right of disposal. Now, we know, and it's common cause in this particular case, that the land at issue here is land held in trust for the community. If I can ask you to go to volume 2 of the papers, at page 215.
Sorry, if I can just go back to the definition of state land.
Yes.
It's an inclusive definition. It says it includes any land over which the right of disposal, and then it lists various pieces of legislation. So presumably this is, sorry.
I'm sorry, Justice Rogers. Yes.
The state land includes any land over which the right of disposal by virtue of certain provisions vests in the state president. So that extends the definition beyond its ordinary terms. I haven't looked at those provisions, but presumably those might be circumstances where the land isn't registered in the name of the state, but it's got some right of disposal.
Yes.
So the primary state land is any land, I presume, that's registered in the name of the state.
That's correct. But we would
so the right of disposal that is referred to there is not a necessary element of the definition of state land.
We would submit, Justice Rogers, that the right of disposal is actually fundamental to the entire purpose of the Act.
It might be fundamental to the lawful exercise of the powers, but in order to constitute state land, this definition you have read is extending it beyond its ordinary meaning. And its ordinary meaning would encompass any land registered in the name of the state.
Well, we would submit that in order for the minister to prove that he acted within the ambit of the statute, he has to bring the land in question within the definition of state land. And
yes, but he doesn't have to bring it within this inclusive part, because this refers to certain fairly ancient legislation, the Transvaal Act and so on. Well, so there's a whole lot of state land which isn't encompassed by this definition.
If we have regard, Justice Rogers, just an answer to that question, if we have regard to, it's at volume 2, page 215. This is the certificate prepared by the minister on the same day on which he took the decision to dispose. And in this document, the minister tells us what the nature of the land is. And he describes the land. I, Derek Hanekom, Minister of Land Affairs, acting in the name and behalf of the Republic, etc., do hereby certify that the following property owned by the state, namely, and that's the description of the land, is vested in the Republic of South Africa, but this is the important part, in trust for the Ibotwe tribe. in terms of Section 239 of the Constitution. And you remember those are the transitional provisions. And then he requests the Registrar of Deeds of Mthatha to endorse the relevant title deeds, registers, etc., in order to register the immovable property in the name of, in the said Republic of South Africa, in trust for the Ibotwe tribe. So we would submit that this is the state of affairs as at the day on which the decision was made, that the land is held by the state in trust for the Ibotwe tribe, that this takes it outside the ambit of state land, whether or not you include the rider, that they should have the right to dispose. But we would submit it would be a necessary one, given that you are going to be disposing of the land. You should have the right to dispose of the land. But the fact that the land is held in trust for the Ibotwe tribe means that it falls outside the ambit of the State Land Disposal Act. Now, of course, we've put this argument up in the papers, and the minister has come with absolutely no explanation. He relies on the proclamation. What the proclamation does is it extends, firstly, it gives the assignment of the powers from the president to the minister, but it also extends the application of the State Land Disposal Act to the former TBVC states. But what it doesn't do is say why this particular land, which is held in trust for the community, why this land is capable of disposal under the State Land Disposal Act. And that's the sharp point of the ultra vires argument, which is a further basis on which we say the decision is unlawful. The final issue for me to address, Justice Shongwe, is the question of costs.
Sorry, can I just, on the other aspects of ultra vires, you're not persisting with arguments that the President in the proclamation didn't have the power to declare that the relevant minister was the land minister?
No, we don't persist with any of that. For present purposes, I have to say for present purposes because those arguments were constructed by my leader at the time. So.
Very well, you're dealing with the question of costs.
We wish to draw the court's attention to the decision of the Constitutional Court, a very recent decision of the Constitutional Court. The judgment is called Nikara, Niekara. Surname is Harriral, Harriell, versus University of KwaZulu-Natal. It's a 2017 ZACC, page 38.
Case 38.
ZACC, page 38. That's the neutral citation. Now, this is a very recent case of the Constitutional Court in which the court reaffirmed the BioWatch principles. And it stated that it reaffirmed the general principle that in relation to costs in constitutional matters. And it stated in Harilau that the rule applies in every constitutional matter involving organs of state. And it restates the purpose of the rule, which, and we're all aware of the purpose of the BioWatch rule. But the court also dealt with the exceptions to the rule. And it reaffirmed that the exceptions to the rule is where the litigation is either vexatious or frivolous. And the court goes on, the Constitutional Court is then at pains to describe what type of litigation is vexatious and what type of litigation is frivolous.
But shouldn't, before you get there, first ascertain whether the litigation is constitutional or not?
Yes.
And then you move to the second leg.
That in fact, Justice Matopo, that's in the scheme that the Constitutional Court adopted, that's the third leg.
Yes, but in that case, the applicant was asserting a right to education.
That's correct.
Constitutional right.
Yes. What the applicant was doing, Justice, was she was wishing to take on review the decision of the university not to admit her.
I'm well aware of the case.
I am, yes, and I'm about to. I know that you are the. What the Constitutional Court found is that the decision of this court that there were no constitutional implications in that decision, that case was incorrect. That where a party comes to court in order to assert a Section 33 right or a Paja right or even a right under the doctrine of legality, that is a constitutional case and that therefore it falls within the realm of BioWatch.
But we haven't yet reached the point, have we, where we haven't yet reached the point where BioWatch applies to every review case.
No.
I mean, if a tenderer wants to set aside the unlawful awarding of a tender, the normal order is that if the review application fails, it is dismissed with costs. What was important about Harilal was that there was a fundamental right of freedom of expression and freedom of association, which was said to be implicated. Now, what is the fundamental right underlying this review, other than the protection of your client's property right?
Well, we submit that it goes way beyond a property right. There are
let's say her customary rights.
Yes, there are serious customary law rights that are infringed, and those are protected under the Constitution. And we submit that there is no reason why those rights should be treated differently from the right to education or any right to dignity.
But if I sue for money owing on a contract, I'm looking to protect my proprietary rights under the contract. But that's not enough to make it constitutional.
Justice Rogers, when you come to court to enforce your right to secure tenure under customary law, that's a different right from a right aimed to protect a commercial interest. And that's the right which Mrs. Mandela has come to court to protect. There are other aspects of the case that deal with legality issues and with a litigant coming to court in the face of what appears to be an unlawful decision. And she should have the right to get redress from the court without the risk of a serious serious cost order. So we would submit that this case falls patently within the bounds of BioWatch. The quota quo was, to a large extent, adopted the line of this court that this court did in Harilal, that there were no constitutional implications. And on its own, that the Constitutional Court has clearly said that that's an incorrect principle. And
Can I just ask, though, is the constitutional implication here that it concerns the legality of state action, or is the constitutional issue that it concerns the protection of customary rights, or do you say it's both?
Both, and more.
But if you're correct, then it would mean that BioWatch applies to every review where there's a legality point.
Well, we would submit that the legality in the way that is presented here certainly does apply.
Because in a sense, every PADGA review, I know we don't call it a legality review, but an absence of legality ultimately lies at the heart of any PADGA review as well.
Justice Rogers, I would submit that that should be the default position unless the state entity can demonstrate that, in fact, the litigant is driven by a commercial interest, which would then move you out of the realm of BioWatch. So we would submit in this case the application is clearly not frivolous, it's not vexatious, it's not designed to purely protect a commercial interest, and that there's no reason why Mrs. Mandela should not fall within the bounds of BioWatch.
Thank you, Ms. Pillay. Yes, Mr. Malika.
Justice Shongwe, what we propose to do is to make some few introductory observations relating to the concluding submissions made on behalf of the appellant insofar as they affect the first respondent. And as we understand the fundamental basis of those submissions is that there is before the court a decision that is so patently unlawful that it will be subversive to the democratic order of this country not to scrutinize that decision, despite the delay in the application which has been brought to challenge those decisions. We would respectfully suggest that that starting point is mistaken because the delay rule is premised on promoting the spirit of the democratic order set out in the Constitution. It promotes clean governance because one of the fundamental bases of it, as we understand it, is that it is in the interest of the public to ensure that decisions which have been taken should remain certain. And if there is a delay in challenging those decisions, resulting in potential prejudice to those who relied on that decision to organize their life, then the court would refuse to enter into an inquiry about the lawfulness or otherwise of those decisions. So that we would differ with our learned friends in regard to the starting point of the submission, that the delay rule as applied by this court and the Constitutional Court is premised on promoting clean governance and not to subvert it. The second introductory proposition we would like to make is the invitation posed by learned friends.
Those were proceedings at the legal battle over Madiba's Qunu homestead. For now, we continue with your main news.